Harry Potter has been analyzed to death. Not regular death, like full necromancy, dug up, turned into a 10-part video essay and a Reddit megathread kind of death. You might be asking yourself what could possibly be new about Hogwarts at this point, and why you willingly clicked on yet another deep dive about a castle you could probably navigate blindfolded. And honestly? Fair. If you're like me, you grew up swimming in this stuff, staying up too late with the books, marathoning the movies, maybe wandering through the PS2 game version of Hogwarts where every corridor was just slightly wrong. And somewhere along the way, it started to feel like we'd squeezed this world completely dry. Because we all have the same mental postcard of Hogwarts, right? The Great Hall with the floating candles and the enchanted ceiling. The Sorting Hat breaking into its weird little union-mandated song. The moving staircases being deeply unsafe, but very whimsical about it. In case you've forgotten, you can probably still feel the first time those doors open, and everything is golden and cozy, and you're like, yes, I would absolutely sign away my child's safety for this vibe. But that image in your head? It's mostly the films, stitched together with a few half-remembered book details, and maybe a theme park commercial you saw once at 2 a.m. Here's where it gets messy. Hogwarts is supposed to be the safest place in the wizarding world. Dumbledore says it. McGonagall says it. Everyone ships their kids off like it's a magical Switzerland. But when you actually look at the rules, the maps, the timelines, the random Pottermore essays, the video games, the illustrated editions, the theme parks, they all contradict each other so badly that the real castle basically can't exist. Where are the dormitories? How many towers are there? Why does the third-floor corridor move every time EA releases a new console? So here's the bold claim. When you line up the early drafts from Rowling's notebooks, the cut ghosts and extra houses that never made it in, the Pottermore floor plans, the game maps that cram in whole extra courtyards, the theme park shortcuts, and all the weird companion texts nobody finished reading, a totally different Hogwarts starts to appear. It's busier, darker, structurally impossible in a way that would make an architect cry and then probably fall down a moving staircase. And this isn't just, oh, the continuity is bad, haha, gotcha. We're going to treat it like an iceberg. On the surface, you've got cozy boarding school chaos. Underneath, you've got lethal architecture, cursed classrooms, hidden social systems, and a timeline that only works if the castle is basically alive and lying to you. You don't have to take my word for it, but by the end of this video, whether you were the kid waiting for your Hogwarts letter every year, or you just watched the films once on cable, you're going to know a version of this school that's more complete than anything Rowling actually put on the page. And once you see that version, the safe Hogwarts kind of stops existing. So what are we actually doing for the next 2 hours besides ruining your childhood architecture? Let me lay it out, because you might be asking yourself why this needs to be feature-length and not, like, a chill 12-minute listicle. Big picture, we're going to stitch together 5 veins of Hogwarts lore that usually live in totally separate corners of the fandom. First, the cut drafts and early notes Hogwarts, the scrapped ghosts, abandoned house ideas, weird extra subjects that lived in Rowling's notebooks for a hot second and then got quietly buried. Second, Hogwarts in other media, the video game castles that have entire districts no one ever mentions, the illustrated editions that sneak in new rooms, the Pottermore essays that casually retcon how the school even works. Third, the timeline and geography nightmares where term dates, class schedules, and staircases refuse to behave like a real building. Fourth, the dark safety problems, lethal architecture, cursed objects in classrooms, punishments that would get any real head teacher fired before lunch. And finally, the hidden social systems that decide what everyday students actually experience when they're not hanging out with chosen ones. All of that is wrapped in an iceberg. Not the meme you scroll past at 2 a.m. and forget, but a proper, structured iceberg where each level goes deeper into obscurity and straight-up weirdness. We'll start at the surface with the assumptions the movies trained you to have. The cozy Great Hall, the moving staircases, the safest place in the wizarding world. Marketing pitch. Then we keep dropping into conflicting floor plans, ghosts you've never met, classrooms that appear once and then vanish, until we're at stuff like scrapped poltergeists, forbidden towers, and architecture that literally cannot exist in three-dimensional space. Along the way, I'm promising some specific payoffs. By the midpoint, you're going to see a Hogwarts floor plan that, when you actually map it, breaks basic geometry so badly it might as well be a cursed object. By the end, the school's going to look less like a whimsical boarding fantasy and more like a borderline unsafe workplace with a body count no one puts on the brochure. And we're going to build a social reality for the non-hero students, the kids who are just trying to pass transfiguration, navigate house politics, deal with blood status drama, and maybe not get turned to stone on the way to charms. If you're like me, that version feels way closer to a messy boarding school drama than a clean hero's journey. Tone-wise, this is not a dry lore wiki. I'm going to make jokes, point out how casually everyone accepts child endangerment, and probably bully a few staircases, but it's all sitting on obsessive research, direct book quotes, Pottermore relics, interviews, game maps, even theme park layouts. You don't have to take my word for it. I'll show you where the bodies are buried. Metaphorically. Mostly. And if you end up liking this style of overthinking magical real estate, I don't know where you've been, because I'm already sketching icebergs for places like the Ministry, St. Mungo's, maybe even Azkaban. But first, we need to start at the top of the Hogwarts iceberg and see how fast the safe version falls apart. So, when I say Hogwarts iceberg, some of you instantly picture that meme diagram with the little labeled layers, and some of you have apparently been living under the lake with the giant squid. No judgment. If you're like me, you probably saw so many of those charts on Twitter that your brain just started auto-filtering anything with a triangle in it. Very quick version, in case you've forgotten. The iceberg is just a metaphor for knowledge. The tip is the stuff everybody knows without trying. For Hogwarts, that's movie visuals, house colors, Slytherin bad, Hufflepuff cinnamon roll, the Great Hall ceiling, the moving staircases, all the cozy back-to-school vibes. That's the brochure version. That's the castle you think you're signing up for when your owl shows up. Everything under the waterline is where it gets interesting. Each deeper layer is made of things that are increasingly obscure, or cut, or flat-out contradictory. Early draft Hogwarts with extra ghosts and rejected house names? That's a lower layer. The weird Pottermore essays about plumbing and chamber pots? Even lower. The fact that the safest place in the wizarding world somehow contains a basilisk, a murder tree, and a staircase that just decides you're failing this semester. Yeah, we're sinking by that point. So here's how we're going to use it. We're moving level by level, from the shallow end down into the pitch-black nonsense. Each level has multiple entries, and we're going to treat each one like a mini case study. I'll explain what it is, walk through where it comes from in the books, films, games, or Rowling's notes, and then poke at what it actually means for the real Hogwarts. You don't have to take my word for it. I'll drag in maps, quotes, and the occasional cursed video game cutscene. You might be asking yourself, isn't that just a list? Kind of. but the iceberg structure lets us escalate. At the top, the tone is going to feel pretty nostalgic. Remember the cozy dorms, the feasts, the house points. As we go down, that warmth starts curdling into, wait, why is lethal architecture just allowed? By the time we hit the bottom layers, we're talking about child endangerment, employment law violations, and whether Hogwarts is basically the most dangerous workplace in Britain. I mean, come on. At some point, Ofsted should have shown up with a flamethrower. To keep you in the game, I want you to treat this like a low-key quiz. Every time an entry comes up, mentally score yourself. Did you already know it? Have you vaguely heard it? Or is this the first time anyone has told you that the castle layout literally cannot exist on a real map? See how deep you make it before you tap out and go, okay, that's too cursed. I'm done. And as a pattern interrupt, every so often I'm going to jump from something kind of cozy to something that makes you reevaluate the whole school in one sentence. 1 minute we're in the Great Hall. The next minute we're in a cut draft where there were even more ghosts haunting the toilets. From here, we'll start right at the top layer. The Hogwarts you think you know, and why even that version already doesn't add up. So let's start with the version of Hogwarts that basically lives rent-free in your brain, the movie castle. If you're like me, you can probably picture it with your eyes closed. Scottish Highlands, big dramatic lake, that insane stone viaduct bridge the train glides over like it's a tourism ad for "Come die mysteriously in the north." The Great Hall is this cathedral-sized space with 4 long tables, a raised staff dais, floating candles, enchanted ceiling. The whole thing shot like Hogwarts is also a minor European monarchy. And because those visuals are so strong, they quietly overwrite whatever you built in your head from the books. You might be asking yourself, did I ever actually imagine my own Hogwarts? Or did the DVDs just patch update my childhood? The film layout feels fixed. Courtyard here, clock tower there, Hagrid's hut down the slope on the edge of the Forbidden Forest, Quidditch pitch way out on its own dramatic cliff. It's all very Google Maps, Wizard Edition. But when you go back to the text, the castle is way vaguer and way slipperier. The books care about mood, not floor plans. Corridors are long or twisting. Staircases seem to move of their own accord. Towers are mostly just high and windy. We get vibes. We do not get blueprints. Scenes are described around feelings and plot beats. Harry is lost. Harry is late. Harry is sneaking. The geography bends around whatever emotional tone Rowling wants in that moment, which is great for storytelling and absolutely terrible for anyone trying to draw a map that isn't a liar. You don't have to take my word for it. The contradictions start almost immediately. Hagrid's hut in the first 2 movies is down a gentle slope near the forest. Kind of cozy. Like you could trip and accidentally end up in a Care of Magical Creatures lesson. By Prisoner of Azkaban, it's migrated to this steep hill with massive pumpkins and a death drop staircase. The Quidditch pitch jumps around too. The early films put it in a valley with wooden towers. Later movies crank the verticality until it looks like OSHA would just spontaneously combust. In the books, the pitch is on the grounds, near the forest, but not hanging off a cliff like a broomstick-related insurance scam. Even the Forbidden Forest sort of drifts. Sometimes it's right there, pressing up against the lawns. Sometimes there's a big buffer of grass and paths. The text will say things like, "They crossed the grounds," and we're going to just accept that crossing the grounds can apparently take anywhere from 30 seconds to a full anxiety attack. All of this is our first little signal that there isn't one authoritative Hogwarts. There are overlapping, sometimes incompatible versions stacked on top of each other. Your mental map, the book's mood map, the film's prestige drama castle. I mean, come on. If we can't lock down where a single wooden hut lives, what happens when we start adding dungeons and secret rooms? And once we invite in the video games, Pottermore essays, illustrated maps, and even Rowling's early drafts, the movie Hogwarts starts to look less like canon and more like one very expensive fan interpretation. In case you've forgotten, we haven't even touched the versions where entire extra courtyards appear out of nowhere. That's the next layer down the iceberg. So let's break your brain a little bit. Right now, I want you to picture walking from the Gryffindor common room to the Great Hall. You're probably seeing the Fat Lady, a corridor, some stairs, maybe a random suit of armor that's only there to get jinxed by Fred and George. Got it? Okay. From the Great Hall, head down to the dungeons for potions. Where do you turn? How many staircases? Are you going past the Slytherin common room, or is that just a vague green vibe in your head? If you're like me, your internal Hogwarts is already glitching and quietly importing movie shots to fill the gaps. Because you don't have to take my word for it. The books themselves treat Hogwarts like a place you literally cannot map. In Sorcerer's Stone, Harry gets lost on the way to class constantly. He ends up near a room full of screaming armor on the 3rd floor, when he meant to be on the 2nd, in a corridor that suddenly dead ends because the door, quote, won't open unless you ask it politely. In case you've forgotten, the staircases don't just move. They change where they lead, which is way worse. By Prisoner of Azkaban, the trio are still confused about shortcuts, secret passages, and which staircase is going to dump you outside Filch's office this week. The narrative is basically saying, do not treat this like a normal building. You will die. And then we, years later, go, yeah, of course, and immediately build a neat little floor plan in our heads anyway. Here's where it gets messy. Different sources come in and start locking things down. The films decide, this is the bridge, this is the courtyard, this is exactly how you walk from Gryffindor Tower to the Great Hall in 4 elegant crane shots. The early PlayStation games say, actually, the dungeons are over here, the greenhouses are in a different zip code, and by the way, defense against the dark arts moved 3 floors since last cutscene. Then the illustrated editions and official maps commit to their own layouts that don't quite match either of those. The theme park has to turn all this shifting, unreliable stuff into fire exits and ADA-compliant ramps. You might be asking yourself, which one is real? And the answer is kind of cursed. All of them. Which means none of them. So for the rest of this iceberg, we're going to treat Hogwarts like a crime scene. Every book passage, every game map, every Pottermore essay is a witness statement. We're going to line them up, circle the contradictions in red ink, and see what kind of impossible, OSHA-violating nightmare castle they describe when you force them to coexist. And that's just the geography. Once we start stacking the timeline on top of it, class schedules that don't fit in a day, feasts that happen on dates that don't exist, full moons that refuse to cooperate, Hogwarts stops being just a castle and starts looking like a magical reality glitch pretending to be a school. The next layer down is where the calendar really breaks. The calendar breaks, and then Dumbledore looks you in the eye and tells you this place is the safest place in the wizarding world. I mean, come on. He says it over and over. Safest place in the wizarding world. Safest place in the wizarding world. Like if he repeats it enough times, it becomes a legal disclaimer. And in case you've forgotten, he's saying this in a school that currently contains 1 murder snake in the plumbing, 1 homicidal Volkswagen tree in the front yard, and a forest full of things that eat centaurs for breakfast. You might be asking yourself, is that just British boarding school standards, or are we already in magical OSHA violation territory? Look at the first 2 years. Year 1. A fully grown mountain troll gets into the castle, knocks out a teacher, and almost kills an 11-year-old in the bathroom. Response? 10 points to Gryffindor and a funny story for later. Year 2. A centuries-old basilisk is roaming the pipes, petrifying children, ghosts, and cats, and the official safety protocol is Lockhart signing autographs and some roosters quietly disappearing off-screen, and that's before we talk about the architecture. The staircases move, not in a cute, whoops, wrong landing way, but in a, congratulations, you are now outside the forbidden third-floor corridor with the 3-headed dog we told you would literally kill you. Way, this is a building that can just decide your route today includes a boss fight. Imagine your real school having escalators that occasionally dump you into the chemistry lab during an explosion, and the principal going, "Ah yes, character building." Then they send first years into the Forbidden Forest as detention, not upper years with combat training. The kids who still say, Wingardium Leviosa. That forest has werewolves, giant spiders, and a guy drinking unicorn blood out of the dirt. But sure, let's go look for a missing horse. And hanging over all of this is Quidditch. The national pastime that's basically, what if we combined rugby, NASCAR, and mid-air workplace accidents? Falling 50 feet is a normal Tuesday. People get bludgers to the head, broken arms, cursed brooms, and the staff reaction is mostly, walk it off, you've got practice tomorrow. If you're like me, you grew up wanting to play, and then you reread as an adult and realize this is just child endangerment with team colors. Most readers, and honestly the books themselves at first, treat all of this as whimsical slapstick. Kids' book logic. Cartoon danger where nobody really dies, and the worst thing that happens is a trip to the hospital wing and some chocolate. The problem is the series doesn't stay that kind of story. By book 5, we're in full-blown torture, fascism, and war crimes, and the text wants you to take that very seriously. You don't have to take my word for it. The body count speaks for itself. So you end up with tonal whiplash. The same institution that once played off a troll attack as wacky hijinks is now the last line of defense in a wizarding civil war. And the narrative never really goes back and says, hey, maybe sending children into Spiderwoods was a red flag. Instead, it quietly expects you to file those early years under, don't worry about it. At this level of the iceberg, we're still in stuff most fans recognize. The troll, the basilisk, the forest, the lethal sport. We're going to start treating them as data points instead of nostalgia. Because once you stop laughing and actually list it out, Hogwarts doesn't just have a few dangerous moments. It's structurally unsafe in a way the story never fully admits. And the wild part? These are the training wheels. Deeper down, the castle starts fighting back. Punishments that scar for life, curses built into the classrooms, institutional choices that make a giant snake in the plumbing look almost wholesome. If the top layer is, haha, magic school is dangerous, the next ones are, oh, this place might actually want to hurt you. So if the building itself is trying to kill you, who are you supposed to eat breakfast with while that's happening? Because on the surface, Hogwarts gives you a very simple answer. Your house. Your little color-coded survival squad. In case you've forgotten, the official marketing pitch is weirdly tidy. Gryffindors are brave, Slytherins are ambitious, Ravenclaws are smart, Hufflepuffs are loyal and hardworking. The Sorting Hat literally sings you a personality quiz every year like, "Step right up, children. Get your Hogwarts brand identity." If you're like me, you probably read that at 11 and went, "Ah yes, I am obviously a insert house here. Destiny has spoken." And not, "Wait, this is how they structure an entire school." You might be asking yourself, okay, cute branding, but does it actually work like that? The books immediately start undercutting it. Instead of 4 cozy vibes, we pretty much get 4 rival gangs with dormitories. House-based bullying is baked into day 1. Slytherins sneer at Hufflepuffs. Gryffindors and Slytherins are in a permanent Cold War with occasional Quidditch-related casualties, and teachers just pick sides. Snape taking points from Gryffindor because Harry exists, McGonagall giving her own house the benefit of the doubt, Slughorn building a Slytherin-heavy slug club of favorites. At a certain point, it stops feeling like school and starts feeling like 4 mini-schools fighting for custody of the House Cup. And remember, we only ever really see 2 of them. From Harry's perspective, Hogwarts social life is Gryffindor versus Slytherin, lions versus snakes, heroes versus future HR nightmares. Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff mostly exist as background flavor. Here's the smart one with the rad diadem. Here's the chill one with the plants. What does a normal Hufflepuff 5th Year's Tuesday look like? Who's the Ravenclaw equivalent of Seamus, just constantly blowing stuff up but with extra homework? The narrative never slows down long enough to care, which quietly hides what daily life is like for the average, non-chosen one student. I mean, come on, it's a boarding school. Where are the clubs? We get gobstones mentioned once, we see Quidditch a lot, and then silence. No drama society, no chess club beyond Ron and a suicidal set of pieces, almost no casual friend groups that cut across houses. Harry only really breaks the house barrier with Luna and Cedric, and even that's framed as unusual. You don't have to take my word for it. If you've ever seen an actual residential school timetable, it's wall-to-wall societies and weird little niche groups. Hogwarts has a literal lake monster, and somehow not a single official, "Please don't die in the forest." Hiking club. On this top layer, the social map looks simple. 4 houses, some rivalries, done. But deeper down, we're going to start pulling in Pottermore entries, companion books, and game maps that quietly add secret clubs, hidden common rooms, and founder drama that blow that neat diagram apart. And speaking of blowing things apart, we need to pause the lore iceberg for a second and talk about the part of Hogwarts nobody wants to think about, the health and safety report. Because if you're like me, you grew up wanting your Hogwarts letter. If you actually got it in 2026, your parents' lawyer would probably frame it as Exhibit A. So imagine this as a mockumentary. We're going to follow a modern UK safety inspector doing a routine visit on the safest place in Britain. Clip-on tie, clipboard, high-vis vest. He walks in, sees a staircase casually sliding sideways with no warning signs, half the steps missing railings, and one random stair that just eats your leg. No tape, no cone, no mind the gap, just congratulations, you live here now. He tries to write trip hazard, and the quill bites him. You might be asking yourself, okay, but isn't that just whimsical magic? Sure, until you remember this is a boarding school with 11-year-olds and also a literal poltergeist whose main hobby is throwing objects at their heads. In case you've forgotten, Peeves drops walking sticks on people, smashes ink bottles, and once tries to drop a whole bag of something heavy on students. That's not spirited atmosphere, that's ongoing assault by airborne stationery. Then we get to the armor. In the films, it's cute background stuff, clanking around at Christmas. In the books, McGonagall literally brings the suits of armor to life to fight in the Battle of Hogwarts. So from the inspector's point of view, every decorative object is a potential combatant. You lean on a statue wrong, and suddenly you're in a union dispute with the wall. Now compare that to actual school standards. Real British schools have strict supervision ratios, DBS background checks, staff training, risk assessments for field trips, all that boring stuff that keeps kids from dying on Tuesday. Hogwarts? One gamekeeper with a history of expulsion escorts you into a forest full of man-eating spiders. No permission slips. No head counts. Just, try not to get eaten. We have exams next week. I mean, come on. Supervision? You've got 4 teachers watching a Quidditch match where students fly 100 feet up in storms while enchanted cannonballs try to break their bones. Background checks? We've got a possessed defense professor, a Death Eater disguised as a limping ex-Auror, and a ministry-installed torturer with a cat fetish. You don't have to take my word for it. The detentions literally involve a blood quill. At this point in the tour, our poor inspector is having a quiet, nervous breakdown in a corridor that moves, with ghosts phasing through him, next to a bathroom haunted by a dead child. He starts the day ticking boxes. He ends it staring into the middle distance, whispering, "How is this legal?" And that's the ethical tension buried in the whimsy. We love Hogwarts. We want to be there. But if this castle actually existed in Britain, it would be shut down within a week. Slapped with so many improvement notices, the parchment supply chain collapses. Up here on the Iceberg, that's kind of funny. As we go down, that workplace accident framing is going to get less sitcom and more, oh, this institution might actually be complicit in a lot of harm, especially once we hit the really dark, almost never talked about incidents baked into the school's history. So if Hogwarts is already a walking HR violation in the final books, what does it look like before Rowling cleaned it up for children? Level 2 is where we crack open the notebooks and realize, oh, the version we got is actually the streamlined, safety-inspected one. Because early Hogwarts, it's crowded, messy. Kind of like if you took the Great Hall and hit duplicate on everything. Extra ghosts, extra classes, extra house names, just spectral and academic clutter everywhere. We know from her drafts and that old Harry Potter and Me documentary that Rowling filled ring binders with house lists, ghost rosters, even subjects that literally never show up. You might be asking yourself, how much can a couple of name changes matter? Weirdly, a lot. Take the houses. In the notes, Gryffindor was briefly Gryffindor, but with different mascots floating around. Ravenclaw wobbled between Ravenclaw and more generic bird names, and Hufflepuff at one point flirted with being the House of Good Fellows in a much more on-the-nose way. Imagine if the branding had leaned harder into that. Gryffindor the obvious heroes, Hufflepuff the designated sidekicks, Slytherin the cartoon villains, Ravenclaw the nerds. I mean, come on, that's already the meme, but the early material suggests she almost locked it in textually instead of letting it stay half-implied. And then you've got the ghosts. The published books already have a decent ghost population, right? Nearly Headless Nick, the Bloody Baron, Moaning Myrtle, the Fat Friar. In the drafts, Hogwarts is basically a supernatural fire hazard. That extended Death Day Party chapter in Chamber of Secrets had way more named ghosts, weird afterlife politics, and side characters who are just ethereal students hanging around centuries later. There's even a headless hunt subplot that starts to turn the whole thing into a ghost social club with bylaws. If you're like me, you read that and go, oh, this was almost a straight-up comedy setting. A school where the living kids are tripping over resentful spirits, failed poltergeists, and maybe a ghost teacher or two, on top of exams and dark wizards. Early notes list extra subjects like wizarding math and more detailed Muggle studies variants, plus clubs and societies that never get mentioned again. It feels less like a tightly plotted boarding school story and more like an overcrowded magical campus sitcom that someone eventually had to declutter so Harry could actually have a storyline. You don't have to take my word for it that pieces of this survived. A bunch of those cut vibes leak into the video games, and Pottermore, random ghosts wandering obscure corridors, extra classroom doors with no book explanation, throwaway lore about long-dead students that only exists in a map tooltip. It's like the ghost of the ghost-filled Hogwarts is still haunting the franchise, and once you notice that half-remembered version of the castle peeking through, you start to wonder, what else from those chaotic early drafts didn't stay dead? And speaking of things that didn't stay dead, we have to talk about the one time the books actually crack the door open on Hogwarts' secret ghost ecosystem, and then slam it shut again. Nearly Headless Nick's Death Day Party. In case you've forgotten, Harry, Ron, and Hermione go down to the dungeons in Chamber of Secrets expecting, like, a spooky little memorial. What they walk into is a full-blown event. We're talking hundreds of ghosts, a spectral band, organized food, invitation lists, decorations, the works. There's Sir Patrick Delaney Podmore's Headless Hunt, with its own politics and petty rivalries. There are ghosts visiting from other places, and Nick himself is anxiously managing his social status like a sad, translucent LinkedIn user. That single chapter quietly tells you, ghosts at Hogwarts are not just background NPCs. They have clubs, factions, celebrity drama, and apparently a calendar. And you might be asking yourself, okay, but was that just a one-off gag? The answer is, it was almost the tip of a much weirder iceberg. Rowling has talked about early drafts of Chamber and Philosopher's Stone, where the ghosts were way more present. We know she had extra named ghosts in her notes, more house-specific spirits, and extended Death Day Party material that got cut for pacing. There are mentions of a ghost who kept losing parts of himself on staircases, a more involved role for the Grey Lady long before Hallows, and a much nastier Bloody Baron who did more than silently drip on first years. If you're like me, you read those scraps and immediately picture a different Hogwarts. One where the corridors aren't just crowded with kids. They're crowded with centuries of dead residents who never left. You'd have first years literally walking through a bickering couple from 1643 on the way to Charms. You'd have Sir Patrick and the Headless Hunt treating the Quidditch pitch as their personal stadium at 3 a.m. You'd have the library haunted not just by Madame Pince's rage, but by exam-panicked Ravenclaws from 5 generations ago still trying to revise. And that would change the tone of the school in a big way. Hogwarts in the finished books is dangerous, sure, but it's still framed as cozy. Moving staircases, talking portraits, a few friendly ghosts who mostly vibe in the background. Shift the dial up to constant spectral traffic, and suddenly it's less boarding school fantasy and more gothic boarding house that forgot to stop being a mausoleum. The living students are just one demographic. The Undead Alumni Association runs deep, has opinions, and probably influences who can sneak into which corridor. You don't have to take my word for it that this was on the table. Rowling's early notes are full of half-used ghosts, and the Death Day Party is the one scene where that density leaks onto the page. It hints at a Hogwarts that's more alive and more dead at the same time, where history isn't just in textbooks, it's literally arguing with you in the hallway. And once you imagine that version of the castle, you start noticing how other media quietly push in the same direction, which we're going to get into next, when the video games and maps start rewriting the floor plan around all those missing residents. And once other media start quietly adding staircases and secret attics, you run into a new problem. Hogwarts can't even keep its own timetable straight. The castle isn't just full of missing rooms, it's full of missing classes. In case you've forgotten, there are whole subjects that technically exist in the books but may as well be cryptids. Ancient runes, arithmancy, Muggle studies, study of ancient runes. Again, when the movies forget what it's called. Care of magical creatures past third year. Divination after Trelawney gets yeeted out a window emotionally. We're told these are actual examinable disciplines with OWLs and NEWTs, and then we see, what, like 3 arithmancy scenes total? You might be asking yourself, did Hermione just vanish into a statistics bunker every Tuesday and nobody mentioned it? If you're like me, you eventually go digging into Rowling's early notes and interviews, and it gets worse. She originally toyed with way more classes and staff roles: a Muggle art professor, a ghost teacher for something spectral, extra assistant positions that quietly dissolve into, I guess the caretaker does it. Some of this leaks out in companion material, where you suddenly hear about ancient studies or alchemy as optional subjects, and you realize the published Hogwarts is the stripped-down version. This is the simplified course catalog. I mean, come on. So what would a real 7-year timetable look like if we actually took every mentioned subject seriously? Start with the basics: transfiguration, charms, potions, herbology, defense, astronomy, history of magic, flying. Add electives: arithmancy, runes, Muggle studies, care of magical creatures, divination, ancient studies, alchemy when it pops up, maybe ghoul studies depending on which interview you read. Then layer in stuff like apparition lessons, dueling club, Quidditch practice that eats entire evenings, and whatever mysterious thing happens in the time turner hours. You very quickly end up with 11-hour school days and third years doing more contact hours than medical residents. And the castle, as described, just cannot host all of that. We have a handful of clearly identified classrooms, some towers, a few dungeons, and then a lot of "they went to class" hand-waving. If every subject runs multiple house and year combinations, you need dozens of specialized spaces, rotating staff, and a scheduling algorithm that would make Hogwarts the true home of advanced arithmancy. Instead, we get McGonagall apparently teaching every single transfiguration lesson personally while also running the school and the Gryffindor Quidditch pipeline. You don't have to take my word for it. Once you bolt on the video games, where you attend extra potion labs and random stealth-based herbology, and Pottermore essays that introduce even more past professors and niche disciplines, the academic side of Hogwarts becomes mathematically cursed. There just aren't enough hours, rooms, or living, and dead, staff to make it all cohere. And that's before the theme parks and game maps start shoving in extra courtyards and towers, which we're going to poke at next, when the castle layout itself starts arguing with the books the way the ghosts argue with each other. And if the building itself can't decide where its own staircases go, you can probably guess the social systems inside it were even wobblier in early drafts. The Hogwarts we got already runs on house drama. The Hogwarts in Rowling's notes is flirting with straight-up magical caste system. So, early on, the houses weren't locked into the neat Latinish branding we know. You've seen some of this floating around. Gryffindor as Gryffindor, or even Gryffindor. Ravenclaw as Ravenclaw, or Ravencliff. Hufflepuff, sometimes drifting toward Huffingpuff. Tiny changes, right? But you might be asking yourself why that matters. Because names are vibes, and vibes are morality. Ravenclaw sounds sharp and elegant. Ravencliff suddenly feels like a gloomy coastal cult. Hufflepuff is already a little silly. Huffingpuff is practically an insult your older brother calls you when you can't finish a sprint. If you're like me, you grew up with Slytherin coded as the bad house. Green, snakes, dungeons, Nazis. You know the drill. But some early notes make them read less like a villain club and more like a straight merit and status house. Ambitious, aristocratic, powerful. Still snobby, still very into bloodlines, but not literally. We produce 90% of Dark Lords by volume. If that branding had stuck, interhouse culture could have felt more like 4 competing political parties and less like 3 normal dorms plus 1 obvious Death Eater factory. And then you've got the Sorting Hat itself wobbling around as Rowling figures out how deterministic she wants this to be. In the books, we get this weird mix. Sometimes it's destiny. I always knew we'd get you, Weasley. Sometimes it's choice. It is our choices, Harry. And sometimes it straight up feels like plot armor. In early concept stuff, the hat leans harder into reading your nature rather than negotiating with you. That version of Hogwarts is way more rigid. You don't argue your way out of Slytherin. You get filed there like paperwork. Now, layer on the social map. Early Hogwarts notes make it pretty clear the houses were pitched as a microcosm of wizarding society. Gryffindor and Slytherin are the old power blocks. Ravenclaw is the intellectual elite. Hufflepuff is everyone else. You don't have to take my word for it. In case you've forgotten, even in the final canon, Hufflepuff is the rest, and Slytherin is the one house you basically can't enter if you're Muggle-born. Crank that up one notch, and you're looking at houses that map almost directly onto class and blood status. Pure blood prestige, half-blood middle, Muggle-born overflow. I mean, come on. Hogwarts already feels cliquey when it's just Quidditch rivalries and common room passwords. In that almost version, you're not just sorted into a personality type. You're slotted into a magical caste on day 1 before you even know how to hold a wand. And the wild part. Some of that leaked into the version we actually got. The question is how far those early, harsher ideas survived into the castle's physical design, which is where the map of Hogwarts itself starts quietly revealing what kind of society it was built for. And that brings us to the people who actually had to make Hogwarts walkable. Not poetic, not mysterious, just, where is the bathroom, and how do I get to potions without getting lost for 40 minutes? Video games had no escape hatch. The books can say, they went down to the dungeons, and hand-wave the rest. The films can cut from the common room to the Great Hall, and you fill in the gaps in your head. But if you're building a game where you, personally, are going to sprint around this place for 20 hours, you need corridors, staircases, collision boxes, all of it. Every major game era had to answer questions Rowling politely dodged, and each era answered them differently. The early movie tie-ins, like Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets on PC and PS2, basically treat Hogwarts like a weird theme park dungeon crawler. The Great Hall is kind of front and center. The greenhouses are glued onto the side like someone installed a conservatory over the weekend. And the dungeons are this massive labyrinth of stone corridors that feel more like a medieval sewer system than a school. If you're like me, you probably got lost down there and just accepted that Harry lives underground now. Fast forward to the late 2000s games, especially Order of the Phoenix and Half-Blood Prince, and suddenly Hogwarts is a sprawling, semi-open hub. Same franchise, totally different castle. The Great Hall shifts, the courtyards rearrange, the greenhouses migrate, and towers appear or vanish like they've been hit with a permanent disillusionment charm. You might be asking yourself, how many times can you move the same building before it stops being the same school? Apparently, a lot. Take one concrete route, common room to potions. In some early games, from Gryffindor Tower, you head down a few stairs, cross a single corridor. Boom. Dungeon classroom. Snape is basically your downstairs neighbor. In the later titles, that same trip becomes this epic pilgrimage, down the moving staircases, through multiple courtyards, past the entrance hall, into a different wing, then finally spiraling into the depths like you're raiding Moria. And in modern open-world Hogwarts, potions might be tucked off a completely different staircase network, with extra side rooms and cellars that never existed before. Same subject, same professor, 3 totally incompatible geographies. And the wild part is, for a lot of people, one of those is Hogwarts. Full stop. If you grew up farming Bertie Bott's beans, speedrunning duels, or 100%ing collectibles, your real castle isn't the vague description in the books. It's the muscle memory in your thumbs. You don't picture, they went down to the dungeons. You picture that specific left turn by the armor that always jump-scared you. I mean, come on. You don't have to take my word for it. Try overlaying them in your head. Early 2000s Hogwarts, late 2000s Hogwarts, modern open-world Hogwarts, plus the film blueprints and the book descriptions. What you get is a physically impossible Escher castle. Staircases that intersect 3 floors apart, towers that occupy the same space, greenhouses that orbit the building like confused satellites. And yet, that impossible composite is also the most complete Hogwarts we've ever had. Next, we're going to start stitching those layers together on purpose and see what kind of school you end up with when reality taps out, but the map keeps growing. So let's actually walk into this chimera castle we've stitched together and see how fast it starts fighting back. Because on paper, you'd think Hogwarts geography is simple, right? Big lake, forbidden forest, some towers, don't fall off the moving stairs or you die. End of story. Yeah, no. Pick literally any major landmark and it breaks immediately. Take the Great Hall. In the books, it's off the entrance hall, ground level, with the doors facing the front steps and the lake somewhere off to the side. In the films, the exterior we see is this long perpendicular building stuck onto the side of the main courtyard, and the interior windows don't match the outside at all. Then you boot up something like the old PS2 games, and suddenly the Great Hall is halfway up a staircase with a balcony that opens into more castle? Where is this thing actually attached? You might be asking yourself if anyone involved ever looked at a single floor plan. The library is worse. Book Hermione is constantly vanishing into the library from the main corridors like it's reasonably central. Film Hogwarts shoves it into a tall, cloistered space that visually reads as a side wing. Hogwarts Legacy moves it into this massive multi-story cathedral of books that practically overlaps with where the hospital wing sits in the movies. If you're like me and you try to overlay those 3, the library either eats the hospital wing or phases through a staircase. Speaking of the hospital wing, in Prisoner of Azkaban, the films bolted onto a skinny bridge that leads straight to the clock tower. In later games, that same bridge leads to totally different interiors. Fan cartographers try to reconcile this and end up with a hospital wing that's simultaneously attached to 2 towers and floating half a floor above itself. I mean, come on. At that point, Madame Pomfrey should be treating people for non-Euclidean vertigo. And then there's the Quidditch pitch. Sometimes it's right next to the lake, sometimes it's way off in the hills. In the early PC games, it's practically in the backyard. In the films, the walk there looks like a light hike. In Legacy, you're basically taking a weekend trek. Line them up, and the pitch migrates like a confused goose. You don't have to take my word for it. Fan floor plans are a whole genre. People spend months tracing staircases from the films, cross-referencing book directions, pulling game mini-maps, and the end result is always the same. Corridors that intersect at impossible angles, towers overlapping, stairs that climb up into rooms that canonically exist 2 floors sideways. The more accurate they get to any one source, the more violently they contradict another. The franchise's in-universe Band-Aid is the moving staircases. Cute idea. Total failure at scale. Shifting steps can't explain why entire wings trade places between adaptations, or why the same classroom window overlooks 3 different landscapes depending on who's drawing it. At that point, the only honest answer is that Hogwarts is magically non-Euclidean, a building that refuses to live in normal 3-dimensional space. Half joke, half the only model that fits the data. And when we start stacking time on top of that space, class schedules, term dates, battles happening in locations that don't exist yet, Hogwarts stops feeling like a school and starts feeling like a narrative pocket dimension that occasionally remembers it's in Scotland. That's where we're going next. So if Hogwarts is already a pocket dimension in space, the calendar is where it fully gives up pretending to be a school and just becomes a time crime. On paper, it sounds normal, right? September 1st, you get the train, Christmas break back home, Easter holidays, then exams and the big end-of-year feast. Very British boarding school. Very respectable. And then you actually try to map it. In case you've forgotten, Philosopher's Stone lays out the template. We're told classes start the day after the feast. Quidditch practice ramps up in autumn. There's a Christmas break. They come back. And exams are in June. Cool. But then Chamber of Secrets immediately starts wobbling. The first Quidditch match is Gryffindor versus Slytherin in early November, except the way the chapters are written, you've only had like 3 weeks of classes since they arrived, and somehow Oliver Wood has squeezed in a full training arc and a whole subplot about new brooms. By Prisoner of Azkaban, the timeline is actively fighting you. We know Buckbeak's hearing is on June 6th from the night bus chapter. Exams are the week after, and the Quidditch Cup final is late April. You might be asking yourself, okay, so where do all the Hogsmeade weekends, Firebolt drama, Lupin's lessons, and Hermione's time-turner breakdowns go? The answer is, into the same 2 Saturdays, emotionally speaking. Goblet of Fire is where the calendar just explodes. The Triwizard Tournament is supposed to replace Quidditch for the whole year, which implies a normal-length school year with 3 big set pieces. But then you look at the dates. The World Cup is in August. School starts in September. The goblet is lit on Halloween. The Yule Ball is obviously at Christmas, and the second task is in February. Cool. Except the third task is in June, and Rowling crams about 4 months of lessons, Rita Skeeter intrigue, and house elf subplots into a space where the previous books barely fit standard exams. Fans who've tried to build detailed Hogwarts calendars run into the same wall every time. You pretty much always end up with too many weekends, or not enough, or 3 life-threatening adventures scheduled for the same Wednesday. The Quidditch schedule is a whole separate nightmare. In some years, every house seems to play everyone once. In others, we only ever see Gryffindor's matches, and the season stretches from November to May, with like 4 games total. I mean, come on. At that point, it's not a sport. It's an occasional weather event. And the films? The films are on their own planet. Prisoner of Azkaban compresses the entire exam season into that one night of Buckbeak and time travel. Half-Blood Prince turns what should be months of Horcrux research into a couple of moody montages, and the weather outside almost never matches the supposed month. You don't have to take my word for it. People have literally freeze-framed the snow levels. If you're like me, by the time you've tried to reconcile all of this, you end up with 2 options. Either Hogwarts is brutally overscheduled to the point of child labor laws, or someone quietly issued the entire staff time turners and told them not to ask questions. And the wild part? The calendar is nothing compared to what happens when you start lining up daily life inside those impossible weeks. So if the calendar is already broken, what does that actually feel like on the ground for, say, a random Hufflepuff third year who is not the chosen one? Because we spend 7 books at this school and somehow almost never see what normal looks like. Think about how little time we actually spend on boring stuff. Meals are either Harry was too stressed to eat, or everyone cheered and there was treacle tart. Homework is a vague cloud of they had lots of essays, usually mentioned only so Hermione can finish hers early. Where are the Tuesday nights where you're half asleep in the library, copying from Miranda Goshawk and pretending you're not? If you're like me, you probably did more actual homework in your real school than Harry does on the page, which is wild for a place that assigns 12-inch essays like their TikToks. Now plug that into the impossible timetable and geography. You might be asking yourself, okay, but for an average Ravenclaw, what does a day even look like? You wake up in a tower, sprint down a moving staircase, cross a courtyard that sometimes exists and sometimes doesn't, then hike all the way to the greenhouses that are canonically on the grounds somewhere, all in 10 minutes between bells. Miss the staircase? Enjoy being spat out on a random floor, late to a class that may or may not be on the opposite side of an unmarked tapestry. Hogwarts must feel less like a school and more like living inside a constantly shuffling IKEA. And remember, this is without plot armor. Harry gets special occlumency lessons, secret data clubs, private chats with Dumbledore. A random Hufflepuff with, say, care of magical creatures, ancient runes, and Muggle studies is just doing that. All week, no prophecies, just 6 straight hours of copy the rune chart and please don't get gored by the hippogriff. Off-screen subjects like arithmancy and study of ancient runes are treated as background flavor. But for those kids, that's their life. They're not sneaking into the restricted section. They're arguing over group projects and trying not to cry in front of Professor Vector. And socially, Hogwarts is weirdly empty. Where are the school assemblies that every real boarding school has? We get the Halloween feast, the start of term speech, and then radio silence. No parents' weekend, no open days, no awkward career fair in the Great Hall where a bored goblin explains banking. The only time parents show up en masse is when someone dies or gets attacked. I mean, come on. Even British schools in the 90s had at least one over-enthusiastic PTA event. Mental health support? Non-existent. Your cat gets transfigured wrong. You watch a classmate get cursed into the hospital wing. You literally see a ghost walk through you at lunch. And the official system is, go to bed, maybe drink some hot chocolate. Try not to develop a lifelong phobia of mirrors. The thing is, tiny throwaway details do hint at a much fuller social ecosystem. We're going to get into obscure clubs, random societies, background characters who quietly imply that some kids are forming gobstones cults in the dungeons, while others are basically running underground study groups. You don't have to take my word for it, but once you start tracking those side mentions, you end up with a Hogwarts that's way richer, way weirder, and way more crowded than the main plot ever lets us see. So let's actually live in that overcrowded nightmare for a second. Imagine you're not Harry, not a Weasley, not even a named extra. You wake up as generic second-year Dusser 47 in the version of Hogwarts we've accidentally built out of every source. You might be asking yourself what that looks like. It starts with you jerking awake in a dorm that's either a cozy stone tower or a random video game mezzanine that doesn't exist in the films, because the composite floor plan cannot make up its mind. Your timetable says Transfiguration at 9, Charms at 9, and also Herbology at 9, all in different wings of the castle. Cool. Breakfast in the Great Hall is your first boss fight. The tables are apparently infinite, but you still somehow end up wedged between a Slytherin who doesn't talk to half-bloods before coffee, and a Hufflepuff who's aggressively recruiting for the Gobstones Club like it's a pyramid scheme. Up at the staff table, Trelawney is only supposed to come down for feasts, but if you're like me and you've read the side material, she's also randomly at normal meals sometimes, staring into her porridge like it's about to predict your death. You inhale toast, because your first class is on the 3rd floor. Except the staircase decides it's feeling quirky today and takes you to a 7th floor corridor that, in case you've forgotten, did not exist yesterday. You sprint past a tapestry that might hide the room of requirement, unless it's the video game version that opens into a completely different secret area with moving armor puzzles. Peeves dive bombs you with ink. Filch appears out of nowhere to threaten you with chains that technically got cut from later drafts, and by the time you skid into Transfiguration, McGonagall has already turned 3 people into ferrets for being late. The bell rings. You blink. Suddenly, we're going to Defense Against the Dark Arts, which is either on the 2nd floor or the ground floor, or that cursed tower from the PS2 game where every corridor is a death spiral. Midday, you try to be a well-rounded student and check out a club you saw mentioned once in a Pottermore sidebar. It meets on Wednesdays. It is currently Tuesday. Also, no one has ever heard of it. A ghost floats by, gossiping about how the Bloody Baron and the Grey Lady are on a break, and you just quietly add that to the list of things you're going to unpack in therapy. Dinner is a blur of floating candles and house rivalry microdramas. Someone's arguing about Quidditch practice schedules that contradict the exam timetable from Prisoner of Azkaban. Someone else is trading chocolate frog cards of a headmaster who canonically never worked here, and you're just trying to remember if curfew is 9:30, or whenever the poltergeist gets bored. By the time you collapse into bed, you've technically broken 3 school rules, crossed 4 incompatible maps of the same hallway, and survived at least 2 OSHA violations. And that's the point. If you actually stitch all these versions together, daily life at Hogwarts stops feeling whimsical and starts feeling like a speed run of institutional chaos, which is going to matter for where we go next. And speaking of institutional chaos, let's talk about the part where Hogwarts starts getting DLC. If you're like me, you grew up thinking canon was simple. 7 books. Maybe the movies if you were feeling generous. And that's it. Then Pottermore shows up in 2011 like, hey, what if the castle had more rooms, more ghosts, and several extra tragedies we just forgot to mention? And suddenly, the school you thought you knew is quietly under construction in the background. In case you've forgotten, Pottermore, and its later Wizarding World facelift, isn't just quizzes about your wand core. Buried between the Sorting Hat animations and Which Biscuit Are You? Energy, you get full essays written by Rowling herself. These are long, lore-dense posts about Hogwarts history, staff backstories, house founders, and weird magical artifacts that never once appear in the actual narrative, but are still presented like, yeah, this was always true. You just didn't look hard enough. Pottermore Hogwarts is like a director's cut, where someone also added new scenes and then pretended they were in the theatrical release all along. We suddenly learn about the Hufflepuff common room entrance with its secret barrel rhythm and built-in vinegar booby trap. We get founder relics like the Hufflepuff cup and the lost diadem framed not just as Horcrux props, but as long-standing house heirlooms with specific hiding places in the castle. We get extra classrooms, moving staircases with rules, and a whole history of teachers who apparently worked there for decades and somehow never got a single line of dialogue. You might be asking yourself, doesn't that retroactively mess with how we read the original story? Yeah, a lot. Knowing that Ravenclaw's diadem had a whole legend attached to it and was supposedly one of the most famous lost artifacts in Britain makes it way weirder that almost nobody brings it up before Deathly Hallows. Discovering that the Hufflepuff common room is basically next door to the kitchens makes all those food theft scenes feel like missed opportunities. And when Pottermore drops extra secret passages and hidden chambers, it raises the question, during all those nights of sneaking around with the Marauder's map, did Harry just never notice half the building? This is where the fandom splits. Some people treat Pottermore as full canon. If Rowling typed it, it's law, even if it lives on a website shaped like an interactive scrapbook. Others treat it as optional DLC, fun, sometimes messy bonus content that you can uninstall in your brain if it breaks the vibe. Which version you pick literally changes the Hogwarts you imagine when you reread the books. And we're going to go deeper, because Pottermore doesn't stop at cute common room details. It casually drops wild founder lore, like the true story of the Sorting Hat, the founders' feuds, and some pretty unsettling hints about what Salazar Slytherin really wanted the school to be. I mean, come on. When the bonus material starts implying Hogwarts was basically founded on a magical Cold War, you know we're heading somewhere darker than a cozy common room tour. The real question is what happens when you take those secret essays seriously and plug them back into the castle we've already built in our heads, because that's where the Iceberg stops being fun trivia and starts getting weird. So when you plug that secret essay lore back into the castle, something really weird happens. Hogwarts stops being this vaguely medieval theme park and starts looking like 4 rival architects buried booby traps in the walls and then died without leaving a floor plan. Pottermore quietly turns the founders into interior designers with agendas. Godric Gryffindor isn't just brave guy with sword. He literally leaves a goblin-made weapon that only a true Gryffindor can pull out of a hat on school grounds. Rowena Ravenclaw gets the diadem that enhances wisdom, which is basically magical gifted kid discourse in jewelry form, hidden in a forest, and then, later, in a junk room. Helga Hufflepuff, in case you've forgotten, has the cup tied to food and abundance, and the whole "I'll teach the lot" thing, and she's also associated with the kitchens and house elves. And then Salazar Slytherin, who hears all that and goes, "Cool, I'm going to leave behind a basilisk, a secret lair, and a giant stone face of myself." Totally normal colleague behavior. You might be asking yourself, okay, but aren't those just artifacts, like fun collectibles? The problem is that every one of these comes with a space. Gryffindor's sword appears in the Sorting Hat in the headmaster's office. Hufflepuff's legacy is literally plumbed into the kitchens and food systems. Ravenclaw's diadem ends up in the Room of Requirement, which is already this reality-bending pocket dimension. And Slytherin builds the Chamber of Secrets under the bathrooms. Once you see it, the pattern is obvious. Hogwarts is riddled with founder-made back doors. The chamber is the loudest one. It's a full-on murder tunnel wired into the plumbing, keyed to parcel tongue, that can only be opened by Slytherin's bloodline. But the Room of Requirement behaves like something Rowena would have sketched on a napkin after 3 glasses of elf wine. A room that appears when you need it, hoards lost objects, and lets you train a secret army? I mean, come on. That's a founder-level cheat code, not just some random castle quirk. And once you think of the castle that way, the house system stops being a cute personality quiz. you're not just being sorted by traits, you're being routed into literal ideological territories carved into the stone. Gryffindors get the tall tower, the heroic vistas, the sword. Ravenclaws get the riddle door and the sky-high study space. Hufflepuffs are parked by the food and the hearth and the work. Slytherins are in the dungeon, half-flooded, literally next to the racist panic room. If you're like me, you start wondering how much of Hogwarts' layout is quietly built around Slytherin's paranoia. The chamber is one thing, but the whole idea of secret passwords, moving staircases, portraits that decide who gets through. How much of that is security theater for a threat the school itself built into its foundations? You don't have to take my word for it. The castle keeps trying to kill Muggleborns on a 50-year timer, and the more founder lore gets retconned in, the less neutral Hogwarts looks. It stops being a school with history and starts reading like a centuries-long social experiment where children live inside competing magical philosophies that literally shape their walls. Which raises the next question. If the building is that biased, what does it do to the kids who grow up inside it? If the walls are biased, wait until you meet the people who work inside them. Because once you dip into the Pottermore staff essays, Hogwarts stops looking like a quirky boarding school and starts feeling like a very underfunded trauma ward with a really good view. Take McGonagall. In case you've forgotten, Pottermore quietly drops that she had a doomed first love with a Muggle, a miserable ministry marriage, and fought in the First War. Suddenly, that strict, no-nonsense transfiguration style reads less like Grumpy Cat in Tartan and more like someone who has watched the government fail, watched friends die, and is now desperately trying to keep a new generation alive by drilling competence into them like it's a shield. When she benches the Quidditch team, she's not being mean. She's being a veteran who has seen what happens when you're not ready. Flitwick gets the opposite treatment. You might be asking yourself why the tiny, squeaky charms professor is suddenly a dueling legend. Pottermore says he's part goblin, a former competitive duelist, and politically awkward enough to be sidelined. That turns his classroom into this weirdly disarming space. He's goofy, he's kind, but underneath he's literally training kids in the exact skills he once used in magical combat. Wingardium Leviosa stops being a cute feather trick and starts looking like lesson 1 of how not to die when someone throws a curse at you. And then there's Sprout. If you're like me, you always liked her in a vague plant ant way. Pottermore quietly reveals she's a Hufflepuff war hero who stalked the castle with Devil's Snare and Venomous Tentacula, and later helps Neville rebuild the school. That earthy, hands-on teaching style? It's not just cozy gardening. It's someone who knows that the next war is coming, so she's making sure her students are comfortable sticking their hands into dangerous things and coming back with ingredients instead of injuries. Stack these together, and you start to see a staff culture that the books only hint at. These people are colleagues who fought on battlefields, lost partners, argued over ministry policy, and then had to sit down in the staff room and grade essays about Moonstone. You don't have to take my word for it. Pottermore is full of little lines about who joined the order, who distrusted whom, who almost didn't come back to teaching after Voldemort's first fall. Now imagine being 11, walking into this building that pretends to be a safe bubble, and every adult in charge is quietly carrying PTSD under their teaching robes. The curriculum looks normal on the surface, but the subtext is war prep. Defensive spells, antidotes, counter curses, even history of magic is basically a list of times everything went catastrophically wrong. And then, weirdly, it stops. Tons of other teachers never get this treatment. Vector, Sinistra, Babbling. Even most of the substitute staff are basically job titles with haircuts. The castle is full of these hyper-developed war veterans standing right next to what feel like magically animated cardboard cutouts. That uneven depth makes Hogwarts feel even stranger. Half real workplace with water cooler trauma, half blank stage. And when you combine that with the lethal architecture and the try not to explode yourselves syllabus, we're going to end up somewhere very specific. Hogwarts starts looking less like a school and more like a barely controlled experimental lab that occasionally hands out albuels. The next layer down is what happens when you map that lab physically and the building stops obeying its own rules. And if the building itself is a barely controlled experiment, the social life inside it is even worse. Because in case you've forgotten, Hogwarts technically has clubs and societies, and a whole student government skeleton that the main story kind of waves at once and then shoves back into the broom cupboard. You might be asking yourself, what clubs? Okay, roll call. We get the Gobstones Club in Philosopher's Stone, mentioned like a sad little consolation prize for kids who don't make the Quidditch team. Pottermore adds a Charms Club, which is exactly the kind of thing Flitwick would run with terrifying enthusiasm. There's a Slug Club, which is less a club and more a networking pyramid scheme with canapes. We hear about a Dueling Club in Chamber of Secrets, which apparently exists for one term, and then never again, even though, you know, war is coming. If you're like me, once you start listing those, you realize the negative space is louder than the text. Hogwarts is a 7-year boarding school with hundreds of magically gifted teenagers trapped in a castle. You're telling me the full list of societies is chess, gobstones, and getting traumatized in the Forbidden Forest? Come on. Based on the crumbs, you'd expect a full ecosystem. A proper dueling society that keeps going after Lockhart leaves, an arithmancy study circle full of kids who think numbers are a personality, a magical creatures fanciers club that keeps trying to adopt something Hagrid found, maybe even a Slytherin-run, future officials of the Ministry Society that's just thinly veiled careerist propaganda. And that's before you get into the weird niche stuff. A witches' choir that does magically enhanced harmonies and accidentally summons storms during rehearsals. A wizard chess league where Ron is a god for the first time in his life. A Muggle Studies Appreciation Society run by half-bloods who secretly teach people how to use a microwave. You don't have to take my word for it. Pottermore and the games keep sprinkling in references to extra corridors, unused classrooms, and random practice rooms that are basically screaming, "Someone is having a club meeting in here off-screen." All of that would blow open the house lines. Crosshouse Charms nerds, Ravenclaw Slytherin alliances in the Dueling Society, Hufflepuff Gryffindor drama in Gobstones when someone accidentally enchants the stones to explode harder. The text keeps telling you that not all Slytherins are evil, but we mostly see them as cartoon rivals because Harry never joins the places where you'd actually meet the decent ones. Layered on top of that are the student power structures that quietly run the place. Prefects control corridors, passwords, and who gets dragged to McGonagall. Head boy and head girl get access to staff-level information and private meetings. Quidditch captains decide who matters socially in their year. That's a whole shadow cabinet of 17-year-olds making tiny political decisions every night while Harry is off chasing Horcruxes. So the real Hogwarts social scene? It's not a hero's journey. It's a messy, gossip-ridden boarding school drama with magic stapled on. And once you start mapping those invisible clubs and power blocks onto the castle itself, the politics get even stranger. And when you lay that social map over the floor plan, you hit the really fun part. The part where you realize Hogwarts isn't just messy, it's actively trying to kill you. We joke about it, right? Moving staircases, trick steps, secret passages. Quirky, whimsical, very British boarding school, but make it magical. But if you're like me, once you stop seeing it through the nostalgia filter, those same features start reading less like charm and more like an OSHA report written in blood. The main circulation system of the school randomly moves. The stairs literally dump first years in front of forbidden corridors and out-of-bounds towers. That's not quirky. That's a systemic safety failure. You might be asking yourself, okay, but isn't that just narrative convenience? Except the text keeps doubling down. Trick steps that swallow your leg and leave you dangling over a stone drop. Vanishing cabinets tucked inside rooms where any curious kid can lock themselves in and disappear into magical limbo. Peeves weaponizing loose suits of armor and unsecured tapestries like he's running a One Ghost Home Alone remake. And that's just the obvious stuff. Once you start cataloging the obscure bits, the castle gets way darker. We hear about classrooms that are cursed, rooms that sometimes exist and sometimes don't, staircases that change destination mid-journey with no warning. You've got entire storerooms full of lethally cursed junk, opals that kill on contact, music boxes that trance you, a literal hand of glory, just sitting around where inquisitive 12-year-olds can find them. I mean, come on. Filch is one squishy, non-magical man. He's not securing that inventory. Near-death incidents aren't rare events. They're basically a house tradition. In case you've forgotten, Hermione is almost killed by a cursed object in a bathroom. Katie Bell is nearly murdered by a cursed necklace that somehow makes it onto school grounds and into a student's hands. Colin, Justin, nearly headless Nick, Penelope, all petrified because a basilisk can wander through the plumbing and pop out in random bathrooms and corridors. None of that works without a building whose pipes, walls, and crawl spaces are effectively a monster subway. And the castle itself keeps enabling this. The Room of Requirement happily turns into an infinite junkyard full of forgotten cursed artifacts, with zero adult oversight that Harry just takes friends into. The Forbidden Forest is glued to the back garden. The Whomping Willow is a school tree. You don't have to take my word for it. The near-miss body count is right there in the text. One way fans try to make sense of this is by leaning into the idea that Hogwarts is built on serious magical ley lines or ancient enchantments that warp space. The moving staircases, the rooms that vanish, the way corridors don't line up year to year, it all feels like a building sitting on top of a magical fault line, where reality slips just enough to be exciting and just enough to be fatal. And the really unsettling part? As bad as the architecture is, some of the darkest stuff ahead isn't about hallways at all. It's about what the institution chooses to do with those hallways, the punishments it hides in the forest, the curses it lets roam the classrooms, and the traditions that make the castle's death trap layout look almost polite. So let's talk about the one classroom that basically has its own body count. The Defense Against the Dark Arts room is supposed to be where you learn how not to die, and instead it's where the castle speedruns, possession any %. If you're like me, you grew up thinking, oh, quirky running gag. The job is cursed. Dumbledore shrugs. Haha. Then you look back and realize, this is a workplace where your predecessors have been maimed, murdered, or turned into a face on the back of a guy's skull. And they just keep hiring. In case you've forgotten, Year 1, the classroom is literally hosting Voldemort under a turban. Year 2, it's Lockhart staging near-death experiences for clout. Year 3, the room gets hijacked by a boggart and Lupin's trauma. Year 4, it's full-on identity theft with Moody/Crouch Jr. polyjuicing his way through the curriculum. By Year 5, Umbridge has basically weaponized the syllabus into psychological warfare. At this point, you might be asking yourself, why are parents still signing permission slips? And that's just the famous one. Once you start adding in the games and side material, Hogwarts turns into an OSHA violation speed map. The PC and console games love throwing you into random side rooms packed with animated suits of armor that attack on sight, cursed tapestries that try to strangle you, or storage closets full of exploding potions and feral books. Hogwarts Legacy adds entire wings with cursed mannequins, unstable relics humming with dark magic, and basements that feel one cobweb away from a full ritual sacrifice. The wild part isn't just that these rooms exist, it's that nobody seems to lock them. No clear signage, no big glowing maybe don't wards, not even a bored prefect babysitting the door. Students are constantly taking shortcuts through areas that look like the set of a low-budget horror movie. You've got first years wandering past classrooms where the furniture is actively trying to kill them, and the adult response is basically, well, they'll learn. And that's where the ethics get really weird. Is Hogwarts secretly running a survival of the fittest program where near-fatal experiences are filed under practical learning outcomes? You fall through a trick staircase, you get cursed by a cursed necklace, you accidentally open a room full of screaming skulls, and the takeaway is, hey, now you know better. I mean, come on, at what point does this stop being education and start being a long-form hazing ritual with homework? You don't have to take my word for it. The text keeps framing these incidents as character building. Harry nearly dies in the data classroom? Growth. Ginny gets possessed by a diary she finds in a school bathroom. Teachable moment. The castle is basically saying, if you survive the architecture and the curriculum, you're ready for the outside world. And terrifyingly, that might actually be the responsible half of Hogwarts' philosophy, because when we get to how they handle discipline and punishment, these cursed rooms are going to start looking like the kid-friendly option. Because when Hogwarts decides you've stepped out of line, it doesn't take away your phone. It sends you into the murder woods with a half-giant and a crossbow. I mean, come on. Let's start with Quidditch, because if you're like me, you probably just accepted it as fun wizard sport and moved on. But look at it as a school administrator for 5 seconds. You've got 11-year-olds on high-speed broomsticks, 50 feet in the air, with minimal padding and canonically homicidal balls. Bludgers literally try to break your bones. The stands have no nets. Madam Hooch blows a whistle, and that's the entire safety plan. In case you've forgotten, Harry's first match involves his broom being magically sabotaged while every adult basically squints at him from the stands. The solution is not, shut it down, someone's trying to kill a child. It's, hey, let's see if the kid can hang on. Lockhart removes all the bones from Harry's arm. The school nurse regrows them overnight, and everyone's like, wow, what a game. This isn't a sport, it's ritualized workplace injury. You might be asking yourself, okay, but that's just the pitch, right? Once you're off the broom, it gets normal? No. Detention at Hogwarts is go into the Forbidden Forest at night to track a blood-drinking monster that's killing unicorns. Or clean trophy rooms full of cursed objects without magic. Or feed the blast-ended scroots that literally explode. Modern safeguarding standards are like, hey, maybe don't leave kids alone with glue sticks. Hogwarts is like, here's a flammable scorpion lobster, don't die. And the oversight is basically vibes. Hagrid means, well, Filch actively hates children. Snape uses detentions to emotionally waterboard teenagers. And that's just fine. Nobody files a report. Nobody calls a board of governors. The board of governors is probably busy approving budget for the murder plants. If a real-world school sent a first year into a forest full of werewolves, acromantulas, and centaurs who openly threaten violence, that school would be shut down before lunch. There are laws, risk assessments, insurance. At Hogwarts, the risk assessment is, bring Fang, he's a coward, but he barks at stuff. What's wild is how fast the students internalize this. Near-death experiences become cafeteria stories. Falling off your broom, getting cursed, almost dying in detention. That's social capital. Trauma is a rite of passage. You don't complain, you compare scars. By 5th year, the kids are like, remember that time we almost died in the 3rd floor corridor? And everyone laughs. And this is where the pattern really shows. Hogwarts isn't just bad at safety, it's training kids to accept constant mortal danger as normal. Under the banner of tradition and school spirit, it's quietly preparing them for a world where war with dark wizards is expected. Quidditch teaches you to fly in chaos. Detentions teach you to walk into the dark with no backup, and by the time an actual army of Death Eaters shows up, the castle can say, well, we prepared you for this. We're going to push that idea even further, because once you look at how the staff reacts when war finally does hit the school, it starts to feel less like a surprise attack and more like a lesson plan they've been rehearsing for generations. And if the battle looks rehearsed, the social stuff feels like it's been running on autopilot for centuries. The monsters get lesson plans. The bullying just gets shrugged at. In case you've forgotten, Hogwarts is basically a non-stop harassment highlight reel. You've got Slytherins hexing Gryffindors on the train, Malfoy's gang trying to curse Harry in the corridors, Katie Bell getting handed a literal cursed necklace in what's basically a school hallway drug deal, and somehow the follow-up is never, wow, maybe we should overhaul discipline. It's 10 points from Slytherin. Don't do it again. And then everyone goes back to Transfiguration like a kid didn't almost die. And that's just the house rivalry stuff. Once you start looking at blood status, it gets way uglier, way faster. The word mudblood isn't just a slur that shows up once for flavor. It's routine enough that first years know it by October. Muggle-born kids are walking into a school where people like Malfoy can publicly spit that word at Hermione, and the institutional response is McGonagall being disappointed and Hagrid saying, "Don't you worry." Cool pep talk, not a policy. You might be asking yourself, who actually feels safe in that system? Because it's probably not the 11-year-old whose parents think she's at a quirky British boarding school, not a soft launch for wizard eugenics. Family wealth quietly runs the place too. The Malfoys can buy their way onto the Quidditch team, buy their way out of Azkaban, and buy the Ministry. And you're telling me that doesn't trickle down into which students get believed when there's a fight in the corridor? If you're like me, you read those scenes where Snape automatically sides with Draco and thought, oh, I know this teacher. The one who believes the legacy kid over the scholarship kid every single time. Teachers don't just ignore it, they reinforce it. Snape publicly humiliates Neville so consistently that his worst fear is literally his own professor. Trelawney calls out students as destined for misery in front of the whole class. Umbridge straight up tortures kids, and the staff's big rebellion is moving her silverware. I mean, come on. Even the good teachers have blind spots. Dumbledore leaves Harry with the Dursleys for a decade of abuse, then is shocked when the kid has trauma. And the house system is like a sorting hat for echo chambers. All the ambitious pure-blood supremacists get funneled into one dungeon, all the brave hotheads into a tower, And then everyone acts surprised when Slytherin becomes a generational pipeline to Death Eater internships. You don't have to take my word for it. The books literally tell you almost every Death Eater we meet is ex-Slytherin. The system clusters similar families, similar prejudices, and then locks them into common rooms where no one ever challenges them. So when people say, "The real danger at Hogwarts is the Forbidden Forest," I don't know where you've been. For a lot of kids, the real horror is eating breakfast with your bullies, sleeping in a room where your trunk gets rifled through, walking past walls that remember every slur carved into them, while the school insists it's the safest place on Earth. And once you see that, the next layer of Hogwarts starts to look even worse. And once you see Hogwarts as this emotionally unsafe place, the next question kind of slaps you in the face. Is it even physically real in a consistent way? Because when you start lining up the calendars and the castle maps, time and space at Hogwarts basically tap out and go home. Take the timelines. We're told the train leaves at 11. It's an all-day trip. Sorting, feast, bed. Cool. Except in Prisoner of Azkaban, that same train journey somehow fits a full Dementor attack, a Lupin lesson, a trolley visit, and multiple long conversations, but they still arrive just in time for the usual schedule. In Order of the Phoenix, they get to school, have a feast, hear a speech, and then Umbridge's little coup speech, and it's still, apparently, not midnight. How long is this evening? 12 hours? Is Hogwarts in its own time zone where sleep is optional? Then you get impossible travel inside the year. In Half-Blood Prince, Harry has double potions, and then is in the common room. Then he's in the library stalking Malfoy. Then he's at Quidditch practice, all on what reads like the same afternoon. If you're like me, and you've tried to make a class timetable, you eventually realize Harry is either sprinting through moving staircases at Olympic speeds, or the narration is quietly overlapping days and not telling you. And characters being in two places at once isn't just a time-turner thing. McGonagall is supervising Quidditch tryouts and also apparently at a staff meeting about security in the same rough window. Hagrid is on gate duty and in the Great Hall. You might be asking yourself, couldn't this just be sloppy summarizing? And yeah, that's the point. Once you zoom in, the year stops being a year and turns into Scenes Rowling Wanted, vaguely arranged in September-ish order. The geography is worse. The staircase to Trelawney's Tower moves floors between books. The hospital wing drifts from being off the main corridor to being near the Charms classrooms. Hagrid's hut in the films literally migrates down a cliff between movies, and the video games go, what if we put the greenhouses on the opposite side this time? I mean, come on. Even magical architects don't rearrange entire hillsides because the level designer got bored. Fans have tried to fix this with some wild theories. My favorite is the Hogwarts is semi-sentient and reconfigures itself to meet narrative need idea, where the room of requirement is just the most obvious example. It's fun, it's elegant, and it totally falls apart. The second you remember, Filch has physical floor plans, and Mrs. Weasley can send her kids a hand-drawn map. You don't have to take my word for it. Any attempt to draw a complete blueprint eventually ends in someone posting, "Okay, the staircase to the astronomy tower just doesn't go anywhere now." At this depth, Hogwarts stops behaving like a school and starts acting like a stage set that slides around behind the curtain, only solid where the spotlight hits. And if that sounds a little mythic and fake to you, good. Because next we're going to lean into Hogwarts not as a place you could walk through, but as a story the wizarding world keeps telling itself. And that's where things get really weird. And if Hogwarts is a story the wizarding world keeps telling itself, Time turners are the part where the storyteller forgets what they said 5 minutes ago. In case you've forgotten, time turners show up in Prisoner of Azkaban with basically no foreshadowing. McGonagall pulls Hermione aside like, "By the way, the Ministry has entrusted a device that can rewrite history to a 13-year-old so she can take more electives." I mean, come on. We're told they're heavily regulated, locked up, only used with extreme caution, and then immediately used to fix a school timetable. Not to stop a basilisk, not to prevent Quirrell from Voldemorting in the girls' bathroom, but to squeeze in arithmancy. Once you know they exist, every previous crisis at Hogwarts starts looking insane. You might be asking yourself, where were the time turners when a mass murderer was supposedly after Harry in first year? When students were being petrified for months in second year? When the Triwizard Tournament was a year-long slow-motion child endangerment scheme? If you're like me, your brain starts doing that Windows XP error noise. Either the Ministry doesn't care about dead kids, or they do, and just forgot their own time machines. And remember, the Ministry's whole line is that they keep strict control over time magic, because even tiny changes can be catastrophic. Cool. Great. Love the responsibility. But then they sign a permission slip so Hermione can literally be in 2 places at once in a castle where staircases move, portraits gossip, and every corridor is a lawsuit waiting to happen. You don't have to take my word for it. The books are full of near-death moments that would go very differently if someone bumped into the wrong invisible Hermione. Rowling clearly realizes, retroactively, that she's opened Pandora's clock. So later Canon tries to quietly shove the box under the bed. In Order of the Phoenix, we're told all the time turners get smashed in the Department of Mysteries, like, problem solved. Don't worry about it. Then Cursed Child rolls up and is like, actually, we've got prototype super time turners that ignore all the old rules, and the timeline starts flopping around like a fish on the dock. Time travel exists, then it doesn't, then it does, but worse. If Hogwarts really honored its own time rules, the school year would never be stable. You'd have overlapping timelines of students redoing exams, professors rerunning deadly incidents, Dumbledore quietly editing history in the background. Every corridor would contain 3 versions of you: the one going to class, the one going back to stop yourself from dying, and the one trying not to be seen by the first 2. Paradoxes wouldn't be rare, they'd be Tuesday. So to keep Hogwarts feeling like a coherent place at all, the narrative just cheats. Time is rigid when the plot needs stakes, elastic when it needs a rescue, and completely forgotten when it would break everything. And that's our real map going forward. Not the castle's floor plan, but the places where the story decides reality is optional. And once reality is optional, space is up for grabs too. Hogwarts isn't just a weird boarding school. It's a continuity error with turrets. In case you've forgotten, the castle is literally built to refuse being pinned down. Staircases move on a whim. Portraits lead to secret shortcuts one week and dead ends the next. Doors pretend to be walls unless you ask nicely, or tickle them, or whatever cursed IKEA hack they require. Filch says it's impossible to know every passage, and the Marauder's map still labels stuff as unplottable. You've got classrooms that migrate floors between books, towers that seem to grow extra stories, and at least one bathroom that is simultaneously 3rd floor, 1st floor, and emotionally in the basement. Individually, all of that is charming. Oh, the stairs moved again. Classic Hogwarts. But stack it together, and you might be asking yourself, is this world building or a get-out-of-jail-free card? Because if you're like me and you've ever tried to sketch a Hogwarts floor plan, you hit a wall fast. Not a magic wall. Rowling did not commit to this wall. Moving staircases mean she never has to remember what's adjacent to what. Unplottable corridors mean the layout only exists shot to shot, chapter to chapter. The magic isn't just in-universe chaos, it's a meta-tool to avoid signing a lease on a fixed map. The Room of Requirement is the most honest version of this. It is literally a space that appears only when the story needs something. Need a secret training base? Boom, fully furnished. Horcrux storage? Sure, plus bonus cursed tiara. Draco's murder workshop? Why not? We've got the square footage. That room is the narrative saying out loud, I will bend geometry to my needs. You don't have to take my word for it. The description changes every time Harry walks in. Once you accept that, it's not a stretch to see the whole castle as one giant room of requirement, quietly reshaping itself so the plot never has to backtrack and say, wait, that corridor didn't exist. And fans have absolutely run with that. Semi-sentient Hogwarts theory says the building is alive, moody, and kind of a troll. It likes some students, hates others, and rearranges itself accordingly. That's fun to talk about. But imagine living there. You're late for potions, and the staircase decides today is character-building detour day. Your dorm route on Monday is a security nightmare by Friday. You probably lose at least one first year a term to the stairs thought it'd be funny. I mean, come on. This place makes the Winchester Mystery House look like a studio apartment. But here's the twist. If Hogwarts is that unstable, then the only version that feels solid is the Frankenstein one we're going to build by stitching together books, films, games, Pottermore, theme parks, and cut notes. That composite castle might be the closest thing to the real Hogwarts that has ever existed, even if no single student in-universe could walk through it without the floor plan changing under their feet. And once you've got that stitched-together mega castle in your head, something really nasty pops into focus. Hogwarts doesn't just look like a structural nightmare, it starts to look like a military academy that's pretending to be a cozy boarding school. You might be asking yourself, isn't that a little dramatic? But look at what actually counts as a core subject. Defense Against the Dark Arts is literally How to Fight Wizards and Monsters 101. It's not philosophy of magic. It's not ethics. It's, here's how to block, disarm, and occasionally blast people across the room. Dueling gets formalized in second year as an extracurricular, and by fifth year, Harry is teaching kids shield charms and stunning spells like he's running a weekend boot camp. Care of magical creatures? Half the syllabus is, this thing will maim you. Here's how to survive contact. That's combat training with extra fur, and the wild part is how quickly that tips over into open paramilitary stuff. Dumbledore's army is framed as this cute, rebellious study group, but step back for a second. You've got a teenage commander, a recruitment system, training schedules, secure meeting location, coded coins for communication, operational secrecy, and a clear enemy. That's a resistance cell. The adults know, too. McGonagall literally tells Peeves how to unscrew a chandelier. The staff doesn't know about the DA in the same way your parents didn't know. You were staying up past midnight with a flashlight and Deathly Hallows. If you're like me, you grew up reading this as empowering. Kids learning to fight back, right? But once you stop following just Harry's camera, the whole culture starts to feel like it's grooming students to be future soldiers. From first year, you're sorted into houses that function like military units with colors, banners, and a point system that rewards bravery and rule-breaking in the name of the right cause. Quidditch is basically aerial war games with blunt instruments. The curriculum never seriously prepares anyone for, like, accounting. It prepares them to hex, shield, infiltrate, and endure. In case you've forgotten, most of these kids are 11 to 17. Imagine being a random Hufflepuff who just wanted to learn plant spells, and suddenly you're in a secret army, practicing disarming charms on your friends because everyone keeps saying, "When the war comes." You don't have to take my word for it that this messes people up. We see anxiety everywhere. Kids throwing up before exams, nightmares after the third task, whole common rooms glued to the radio for death tolls. And that's with the narrative mostly skipping over the average student's breakdowns because they're not the chosen one. By the time we hit Deathly Hallows, the mask is off. Hogwarts literally becomes a garrison under Death Eater control, complete with torture detentions and mandatory dark arts. But the seeds were always there. The real Hogwarts hiding under all these versions isn't a neutral school at all. It's an institution embedded in a magical Cold War that occasionally goes hot. And once you see that, some of the quirky traditions we haven't talked about yet start to look a lot more like soft propaganda than school spirit. So once you clock Hogwarts as soft propaganda for a magical Cold War, you kind of can't unsee the next problem. This is also the least legally compliant school in Britain. Like, if you're like me and you've ever sat through a workplace safety video, you might be asking yourself how this place hasn't been shut down by whatever the wizarding version of Ofsted and OSHA combined is. Let's just reframe the quirky stuff. Moving staircases that randomly change and occasionally dump kids into forbidden corridors? That's not whimsical architecture. That's a premises liability lawsuit waiting to happen. Quidditch with a murder ball flying at 150 miles per hour and 0 helmets? That's not a fun school sport. That's an insurance actuary's stress dream. And the whole mandatory war training via Dumbledore's army, and then actual pitched battle in the Great Hall thing? At that point, Hogwarts stops being a school and starts being a paramilitary training facility that happens to give you AWLs. In a modern context, every one of those is a safeguarding red flag. Where are the risk assessments? Where's the magical equivalent of a school nurse's office that isn't Madame Pomfrey just sighing and regrowing your shattered bones overnight? In case you've forgotten, this is a place where 11-year-olds can get detention in the Forbidden Forest with a known murderer centaur population and a trail of unicorn blood. I mean, come on. Even boarding schools with terrible reputations usually have a policy that isn't send them into the monster woods and hope for the best. And when stuff goes wrong, which it does constantly, what accountability do we see? No inquest after a student is literally possessed for a year and almost dies in the Chamber of Secrets. No independent inquiry when a teacher turns out to be Voldemort on the back of someone's head. The Triwizard Tournament kills a student on school grounds, and the response is basically, "Wow, that was tragic anyway, back to exams." You don't have to take my word for it. The books just quietly move on. What really breaks your brain is that parents keep sending their kids, year after year, after a troll attack, after petrifications, after Sirius Black allegedly breaks in to murder a child, after the Ministry occupies the castle. At some point, this isn't ignorance, it's cultural normalization of risk. Wizarding Britain has lived with dragons, giants, and dark lords so long that occasional student maiming is just part of the brochure. And yeah, wizarding law and ethics are clearly operating on a different axis. They have unforgivable curses, but no clear child protection framework, soul-sucking prison guards, but almost no visible therapy, and a legal system that shrugs at Veritaserum, but freaks out about underage magic. You might be asking yourself whether that makes Hogwarts less morally bad or way worse. I'm leaning toward worse, but this is where we're going to start treating the castle less like a real institution and more like what it actually functions as, a myth. Because the final layers of this iceberg are going to argue that Hogwarts is basically a cultural fairy tale, carefully edited to hide these ethics nightmares under cozy nostalgia, moving staircases, and butterbeer foam. So if Hogwarts is a myth we tell ourselves, this is the part of the fairy tale where the wolf gets invited to teach preschool. Because, in case you've forgotten, the school literally brings the unforgivable curses into a fourth-year classroom and calls it education. Let's go back to that first defense lesson with Moody. You've got a bunch of 14-year-olds, probably still getting used to homework and hormones, and this guy rolls in, slams the door, and announces they're going to learn about curses so illegal you get a one-way ticket to Azkaban. No warm-up, no consent form, just, here's Imperius, here's Cruciatus, here's Avada Kedavra, on spiders, in front of kids. I mean, come on. Rowling doesn't cut away, she slows down. We watch the spider jerk and writhe under Cruciatus, hear Neville's chair scrape as he reacts, see Harry's visceral shock when the killing curse drops something dead right in front of him. You might be asking yourself, is this framed as horrifying? Kind of, but it's also framed as necessary. Dumbledore wants them prepared. The world is darkening. Better they see it here, controlled, than out there, right? Except, if you're like me, you read that scene now and your brain goes, this is a war crime disguised as a pop quiz. These are minors being shown torture and murder for pedagogical purposes. Nobody stops the class. Nobody runs to McGonagall. The fallout is basically, wow, that was intense. Anyway, back to Triwizard drama. And it's not a one-off. Snape's whole teaching vibe is verbal Cruciatus. He doesn't cast unforgivables, but he weaponizes humiliation, fear, and emotional exposure, especially with occlumency. He literally invades Harry's mind, drags out his worst memories, then sneers at him for having them. It's framed as training against Voldemort, but the method is disturbingly close to the thing it's supposed to resist. Psychological violation dressed up as defense. Then you get to the Carrows, and the mask just drops. Under Voldemort's regime, the subject isn't defense against the dark arts, it's dark arts. Full stop. They have students practicing illegal curses on other students, carving slurs into kids' skin, turning the classroom into a lab for state-sanctioned cruelty. At that point, the line between learning about bad magic so you can resist it and we are indoctrinating you into bad magic is not blurred, it's gone. So what kind of institutional culture makes that escalation feel almost plausible? You don't go from Lupin's chocolate and Boggarts to child-on-child torture overnight. You get there by normalizing the idea that dark magic is something you can safely flirt with under supervision, that any brutality can be justified as long as it's in a lesson plan and technically for your own good. You don't have to take my word for it. The staff's reaction is mostly silence. Dumbledore hires cursed professors, keeps secrets, lets Moody run that spider show. The Carrows only get pushback when the whole system is already captured. That's not just a bad semester. That's a school whose moral compass has been quietly demagnetized for years. Which sets up a bigger question we're going to dig into next. If Hogwarts is this willing to flirt with the dark arts in broad daylight, what else is hiding in the curriculum we never see, buried in cut subjects, missing timetables, and those oddly empty stretches of Harry's week? And once you start looking at that hidden curriculum, you hit the really uncomfortable part of Hogwarts. This place is basically a trauma factory with a really good choir. If you're like me, you grew up kind of absorbing the near-death stuff as adventure. Troll in the dungeon? Fun. Basilisk in the pipes? Spooky. But if you pull back for 2 seconds, these are 11 and 12-year-olds repeatedly witnessing attempted murder, actual murder, and possession by a genocidal snake man. First year, Quirrell literally burns to death in front of Harry. Second year, half the school gets petrified, and a girl's bathroom is secretly the entrance to a death maze. 3rd year, soul-sucking prison guards roam the grounds, and one of them almost kisses Harry's soul out. Where is the counselor? Where is the, "Hey kids, let's debrief that time you almost died in a graveyard assembly"? You might be asking yourself, well, maybe wizards just cope differently. But the text doesn't show coping. It shows repression with a side of butterbeer. Harry has repeated exposure to violent death, nightmares, literal PTSD symptoms in Order of the Phoenix, and the institutional response is Snape yelling at him and Umbridge making him carve his own hand. I mean, come on. The closest thing to therapy is Lupin teaching him a Patronus, which is less processing your feelings and more weaponize your happiest memory as a laser shield. And then you look at the ghosts. On the surface, they're quirky set dressing. Nearly headless Nick, the Grey Lady, the Bloody Baron drifting through walls. But read them as metaphor, and Hogwarts is literally haunted by unresolved trauma and history that never moves on. The Grey Lady is murdered by a man who then kills himself, and they're both just assigned to the same building forever. The Bloody Baron is a walking, bleeding reminder of a femicide no one in the school ever talks about in class. That's not just world building. That's generational damage pacing the corridors. Moaning Myrtle might be the clearest example. She's a dead child. She dies alone in a bathroom because a monster was unleashed in the school, and the way the narrative treats her is mostly as a punchline and a convenient exposition machine. People mock her, invade her bathroom, use her death site as a secret entrance, and nobody, in case you've forgotten, seems to have built so much as a memorial plaque. Myrtle is what happens when a school never really reckons with its failures. The pain just loops. Eternally. 14. Crying in the pipes. Now fast forward to the Battle of Hogwarts. We know some students come back to finish their new teas after watching friends, siblings, and teachers die in the same hall where they're now taking Transfiguration. Imagine doing a charms exam while remembering a Death Eater falling off that exact balcony. You don't have to take my word for it. The epilogue casually tells us they carried on, but doesn't sit with what that actually means for a generation that grew up under siege. So the real Hogwarts isn't just physically dangerous, it's emotionally hazardous in ways the narrative mostly skims past. The castle keeps its ghosts, keeps its scars, and keeps pretending everything's fine by next term. And that raises another question we're going to dig into. If the trauma is baked this deep into the walls, what does that do to all the hidden social systems we barely see? House politics, class divides, the stuff that shapes who actually feels safe calling Hogwarts home. And here's where I want to slam the brakes for a second, because if you're like me, you've probably internalized Hogwarts as the cozy school, TM. Scarves, candles, snow, all that good Tumblr core stuff. But if you actually list what's in this building, it's a horror movie location that accidentally got shelved in the children's section. You've got haunted bathrooms with a permanently crying ghost who literally died on site. You've got cursed objects lying around like lost and found items, a diary that possesses you, a necklace that almost kills you, a classroom cupboard full of things the Ministry confiscated because they were too evil to exist. The Forbidden Forest? That's just the Murder Woods with better branding. Secret cult chambers under the school, complete with a basilisk that petrifies children, a body count that includes students, teachers, animals, ghosts, and one very unlucky defense against the dark arts position. I mean, come on. If this was any other franchise, you'd expect a priest and a hazmat team. Now imagine, just for a second, the exact same plot beats shot and scored like a horror film. Same script, Same castle. Different lens. The Great Hall candles flicker a little too low. The staircases creak and groan like they're alive, because in case you've forgotten, they literally are. The camera lingers on portraits whose eyes don't quite move when you're looking, only when you turn away. Myrtle's bathroom is lit like a public restroom in a found-footage movie. Harry hears Parseltongue in the walls at night, and the sound design goes full voices in the vents. You don't have to take my word for it. Give John Williams the week off and drop in a Hereditary soundtrack, and suddenly, Year 2 is a campus slasher with Latin homework. And then, Whiplash. Look at how the fandom packages this place. We're going to knit house scarves, drink hot chocolate out of I'd rather be at Hogwarts mugs, and wear pajamas printed with the castle silhouette, where, reminder, multiple children die or are permanently maimed. The marketing says, cozy common rooms, crackling fireplaces, Christmas feasts. The text says, oh, by the way, the tree might try to kill you, and the ornaments are probably cursed. You might be asking yourself, why are we all so eager to move into the haunted death school? I don't know where you've been, but we have collectively decided that the ideal self-care aesthetic is Victorian orphan in a mildly possessed boarding house. We buy throw blankets of the Great Hall where students attend memorial services. We light Forbidden Forest scented candles like, yes, I would love my bedroom to smell like werewolf and centaur crime scene. That cognitive dissonance isn't just funny. It's a clue. The horror elements aren't a glitch in the cozy fantasy. They're part of the real Iceberg version of Hogwarts the story keeps half burying. Once you admit the castle already works as a horror set, you can start asking deeper questions. Who designed it this way? Who benefits from everyone pretending it's safe? And what else is hiding in those off-limits corridors we never quite see on the map? So once you start seeing Hogwarts as a horror set, you kind of hit the next uncomfortable question. Horror for who? Because a building can be dangerous in a fun Scooby-Doo way, or it can be dangerous in a this place was never built with you in mind way. First barrier is literally at the door. You only get in if a letter decides you're magical enough, which sounds whimsical until you remember nobody actually explains that system. How many borderline kids get missed because their accidental magic wasn't flashy enough? How many squibs are walking around thinking they just didn't get picked, when the castle they grew up hearing about was never going to let them in? You might be asking yourself, well, isn't it just a school for wizards? And yeah, but that's the point. The premise bakes in exclusion before we even hit platform 9 3/4. Then you layer on blood status. Hogwarts is technically open to Muggleborns, but socially? The place runs on an unspoken caste system. Slytherin is basically a blood purity frat house. The portraits casually drop slurs, and teachers let it slide as kids being kids, even when it's actual hate speech. If you're like me, you read that as a kid and went, wow, Draco is such a jerk. You reread it as an adult and go, oh cool, this school has a racism problem baked into its house branding, and we need to talk about who the castle is physically designed for, because I mean, come on. Moving staircases, vanishing steps, trick doors, miles of uneven stone floors, everything lit by candles and fireplaces. Where are the ramps? Where are the lifts that aren't Murderbird operated? We never see a wheelchair user, a blind student, a deaf student, or anyone getting magical mobility aids beyond, like, a cool prosthetic eye that's treated as a gag. You don't have to take my word for it. In case you've forgotten, even when Dumbledore's got an injured hand, he just keeps grimacing his way up towers. The whole place assumes you can sprint, climb, and dodge poltergeists on command. Same deal with neurodivergence or mental health. The only accommodation we see is Madame Pomfrey giving you chocolate and bed rest after trauma. And then it's back to class with the thing that almost killed you. No sensory-friendly spaces. No quiet study rooms that aren't also haunted. No system for, hey, I have panic attacks around dementors. Can I not commute past the soul-sucking prison guards? And socially, Hogwarts is shockingly insular. Almost everyone is British, or at least European. The token international students show up for one tournament and then vanish back into the ether. For a supposedly global magical community, the school we actually see serves this very specific, very local slice of wizard kind. Now drop a Muggle-born kid into that. One day you're doing long division. The next day, an enormous stranger tells you you're moving into a castle with lethal staircases, a forest full of monsters, and exactly 0 orientation sessions. No, here's how not to die around animated armor. No support group for, my parents think this is a cult. Just, welcome to the house system. Hope you like being sorted in front of hundreds of strangers who already know the rules you've never heard. When you stack all of that, Hogwarts stops looking like a universal magical utopia and starts feeling like a very selective machine, calibrated around certain bodies, certain families, certain assumptions about what normal magic is. The castle isn't just hiding monsters in the basement. It's hiding who it quietly decides doesn't belong. And once you see that, you can start asking a much darker question. If this is who the school leaves out, what happens to the kids it actively tries to keep in? And that question is where I have to slam on the brakes, because if we follow it all the way down, this stops being a single video and turns into a course. Like a cursed Wizarding Sociology 101, which, if you're like me, sounds kind of amazing, but we're going to be here for 6 hours, and no one's bladder is that strong. So instead, let me point at a few side corridors we're not going down. Yet? The first one I'm obsessed with is the full history of the Forbidden Forest. Not just spooky trees, centaurs. Don't go in. I mean, what was here before Hogwarts? Why are there acromantulas, centaur politics, werewolves, and a literal colony of giant spiders all inside the property line of a school? At what point did some headmaster look at a nest of 8-foot murder crabs and go, educational? Then you've got the ghosts. We treat them as set dressing, but every single one of them is a walking, talking, unsolved case file. Nearly Headless Nick's failed execution, the Grey Lady's murder, the Bloody Baron's whole deal. You might be asking yourself, do we actually have enough for an entire video on just ghost biographies? We do. Once you start pulling Pottermore entries, cut lore, and weird game dialogue, you can pretty much track who they were, how they died, and what that says about which deaths Hogwarts chooses to immortalize. My new favorite topic, though? The politics of house elf labor at Hogwarts. I mean, come on. Invisible, unpaid staff cleaning up after exploding cauldrons, cooking feasts, and apparently handling dangerous magical waste while Dumbledore twinkles benignly in the background. You don't have to take my word for it. The books literally tell you they're chained to the castle. That's an entire labor history of Hogwarts video waiting to happen, from the kitchens to the room of requirement. On top of that, we've barely touched Hogwarts in games. The PS1 Nightmare Castle, the sprawling modern RPG map, the Lego version where you can just casually yeet yourself off towers and respawn. None of these line up with each other or the films, and I really want to do a dedicated, every video game, Hogwarts mapped and compared deep dive. Same with doing one house's experience across all media. What does it actually feel like to be, say, a Hufflepuff? In the books, films, games, and theme park canon all mashed together. So here's where you come in. Which corridor do you want to explore next? Forbidden Forest history, Ghost Case Files, House Elf Labor Politics, Game Hogwarts, or the all-media house experience? Drop it in the comments, because this iceberg is basically a branching quest line, and I'm using your answers as the roadmap. In case you've forgotten, Hogwarts is just our first oversized test subject. This whole channel is slowly building a broader analytical universe of the wizarding world, and the castle is just where we start poking holes in the magic before we move on to everything else. So if Hogwarts already feels like it's held together with spellotape and denial, I've got bad news for the rest of the wizarding world. The castle is not the exception. It's the pilot episode. Take the Ministry of Magic. On paper, it's this super-regulated, bureaucratic machine. In practice, it's a horror anthology of contradictions. In the books, you have courtrooms that look like medieval dungeons and a literal brain tank just hanging out in the Department of Mysteries. In the films, the whole place turns into fascist brutalist chic overnight. Then you hop to the video games, and suddenly there are extra corridors, hidden offices, and security procedures that make even less sense than Filch's detention system. Which version is canon? All of them, and none of them. Azkaban is even worse. One minute, it's this inescapable Dementor fortress that breaks people's souls. The next minute, Sirius, and then Bellatrix. And then a whole squad of Death Eaters are like, what if we just didn't stay here? You might be asking yourself how a maximum security prison can be both magically impenetrable and also jailbreakable if you're really committed and kind of unhinged. And when you add in the Fantastic Beasts era, where the Ministry is casually tossing people into execution chairs with magic death goo, the whole wizarding justice system starts to look like a fan edit someone forgot to standardize. And Diagon Alley? In case you've forgotten, it goes from cramped crooked street to massive open-air mall, depending on whether you're in the early books, the later films, the studio tour, or the theme park. Shops appear, disappear, merge, move. Nocturne Alley is sometimes a tiny side street, sometimes a full-on cursed neighborhood. If you're like me, you start mapping it out and realize you've basically built 4 incompatible cities that are all allegedly the same place. So yeah, Hogwarts' shifting staircases and retconned classrooms are part of a pattern. The whole wizarding world is this overlapping Venn diagram of books, films, games, Pottermore, interviews, and theme parks that don't actually line up when you try to make a single, clean timeline or map. I mean, come on. We can't even get consistent term dates, and we're supposed to believe the International Flu Network runs on anything but vibes, which is why we're going to keep going beyond the castle. I already have notes for a full iceberg just on wizarding law, Azkaban rules, unforgivable curses, underage magic, house elf contracts, all the stuff that makes you go, wait, is this a government or a cult with paperwork? Another one is brewing on magical transportation, because between port keys, the night bus, apparition, vanishing cabinets, and the fact that the Hogwarts Express exists at all, the logistics are literally a fever dream. You don't have to take my word for it. If you want a taste, I've already done a smaller deep dive on the Ministry trials and a breakdown of wizard travel that's hiding in the playlist on screen. This Hogwarts iceberg is just one branch. If you're enjoying watching the school fall apart under scrutiny, the rest of the wizarding world is absolutely loaded with the same kind of beautiful, broken nonsense we're about to keep digging into. So let's climb back up the iceberg for a second and look at what we've actually built here. Because if you're like me, your mental Hogwarts is starting to look less like a school and more like an OSHA violation with a gift shop. We started at the surface with movie Hogwarts, right? Cozy Scottish castle, big sweeping bridges, the great hall you can practically smell the roast potatoes in. Then we peeled it back. the book version with its moving staircases and suspiciously flexible floor plan. Rowling's early drafts with extra ghosts and rejected house names, the video games where the staircase tower is suddenly 100 miles tall, Pottermore essays quietly retconning what subjects exist, and the theme park that decided, you know what, we're going to just staple Hogsmeade directly onto the front lawn. What comes out the other side is a Hogwarts that literally cannot exist. Geographically, it's nonsense. The lake moves, the forest expands and shrinks. Hagrid's hut migrates around the hill like it's on tiny little legs. Corridors that are upstairs in one map are downstairs in another. And in case you've forgotten, the books themselves already have classrooms that teleport between floors from year to year. Try to draw a master map, and you end up with a castle that folds in on itself like bad Inception fan art. Temporally, it's just as cursed. Term dates don't line up. Exam schedules overlap with Quidditch in ways that would kill any real teacher, and the travel times between classes are impossible unless everyone is secretly using time turners as Fitbits. You might be asking yourself, is that just nitpicking? But once you stack the books, the films, the games, the author tweets, the Pottermore calendars, you get a timeline that kind of wobbles like a broken time turner that's been dropped down a staircase. Architecturally, this place is lethal. We've got shifting staircases with no handrails, moving stone steps that vanish under your feet, a forest full of man-eating spiders on the edge of the playground, a plumbing system that once housed a basilisk, classrooms cursed to the point that teachers literally die on the job, and portraits that can watch you sleep. If this is the safest place in Britain, I don't know where you've been going to school. Socially, it's just as messy. House rivalries baked into the walls, blood status politics in the common rooms, sentient beings doing unpaid labor in the kitchens, kids traumatized by detentions that involve the Forbidden Forest, or writing lines in their own blood. We've basically assembled an institution that's half whimsical boarding school, half gothic horror factory. And the key thing is, this version of Hogwarts doesn't live in any single source. It only appears when you refuse to choose, when you say, no, we're taking all of it seriously at the same time, even when it contradicts itself. That's where the cozy, nostalgic Hogwarts you grew up with collides with the uncomfortable, ethically weird Hogwarts hiding in the margins. So what do you do with that? How do you hold the fantasy school that raised you and the horror institution we've just mapped without throwing one away? That's where we're going next. So here's the uncomfortable answer. You kind of don't hold them. Not cleanly. The contradictions inside Hogwarts are doing the same thing the series itself is doing as it grows up, which is sprinting from whimsical children's fantasy into full-on wartime tragedy without ever really stopping to update the wallpaper. You might be asking yourself, isn't that just kids' books get darker? Who cares? But look at it. Year 1, the castle is this cozy mystery board where moving staircases are quirky and a three-headed dog is basically an obstacle in a platformer. By year 7, we're in a fascist occupation. Kids are getting carved up in detention, and the same moving staircases are now perfect for trapping you during a Death Eater raid. The tone shifts to Saving Private Ryan Jr., but the school is still laid out like it's a slightly dangerous field trip. That mismatch is why the darker, hidden Hogwarts feels so eerie. The setting never fully recalibrates. You still have feasts, house points, Quidditch, while at the same time the Carrows are torturing students, and the Forbidden Forest is basically a mass graveyard of plot devices. It's like the series is saying, war can happen anywhere, even in the place you thought was safest. But it's doing it with the same candy-colored backdrop. And if you're like me, the wild part is how fast we forgive the castle for all of this. We hand-wave the lethal architecture, the child endangerment, The fact that the safest place in the wizarding world statistically has the worst accident record. We say, well, Dumbledore was watching, or magic is risky. The same way we defend real institutions we grew up loving, schools, churches, fandoms, whatever. We smooth over the body count because admitting the place itself might be broken hurts way more than blaming a few bad actors. But that danger is also the fantasy. A school where you might literally die on the way to class is a terrible HR situation and an incredible story engine. High stakes make every friendship feel like a war bond, every exam feel like it actually matters because, in case you've forgotten, failing potions might mean you never learn the antidote you'll need in Book 6. You don't get that feeling from real algebra. And multiple Hogwartsies can live in your head at once. The comforting childhood one with cozy common rooms and pumpkin juice. The horror movie one where the walls bleed history and the suits of armor are just unpaid security guards. And then this overanalyzed Iceberg version where we're going to map term dates, ghost politics, and cut lore until the castle feels more real than your actual high school. So which one feels truest to you now? Does adult you still walk into the Great Hall, or do you flinch at the idea of sending a kid there? You don't have to take my word for it, but whichever version you pick is going to change how you read every corridor scene from here on out. And we haven't even talked about what happens when you line up all the maps, games, and Pottermore essays and realize the real Hogwarts literally can't exist, which means at this point, you're basically walking around with your own private Hogwarts that doesn't technically exist anywhere except your brain. And that's not a bug. That's the whole thing. Everyone has a personalized Hogwarts save file, patched together from whatever you met first. Maybe it's the movie Great Hall, the PS2 staircase nightmare, a Pottermore common room, and that one fanfic where the library is open 24/7. And Madam Pince is only slightly less terrifying. If you're like me, you probably can't even tell where half your mental images came from anymore. They just feel right. You might be asking yourself, okay, so is my version wrong now that we've mapped out this cursed composite Hogwarts that literally can't exist? And the answer is no. That Franken castle we've been building is for analysis. It's the lab specimen pinned under glass so we can poke at the ethics, the architecture, the continuity nightmares without having to live there emotionally. Your Hogwarts is the one you actually inhabit when you reread or rewatch, and that one is allowed to be prettier, safer, or weirder on purpose. So what do you do with all the obscure lore we've just dumped on you like a pile of Zonko's prototypes? You get to pick. Maybe you love the idea that early drafts had extra ghosts and unused subjects, so you quietly add a ghosts union and a cursed alchemy classroom to your internal map. Maybe you decide the basilisk breeding rules are so silly that in your Hogwarts, the ministry secretly rewrote that law centuries ago and nobody told Hagrid. You can steal the best bits from the games, the theme park, the illustrated editions, and just mod your castle. On the flip side, in case you've forgotten, we also spent a lot of time making Hogwarts sound like the most dangerous workplace in Britain. Lethal staircases, child soldiers, mandrakes as biological weapons, all that fun stuff. If that complicates the cozy, escapist Hogwarts you grew up with, that's okay. It's really normal to feel a little whiplash when the school that raised you as a kid reader suddenly looks like it needs an OSHA raid and 3 human rights reports. You're allowed to keep a comfort Hogwarts that quietly ignores the worst injuries and lets the term schedule actually make sense. You're also allowed to lean into the horror version where the hospital wing has a punch card system, or run both at once, the aesthetic postcard castle and the messy, ethically cursed one living under the floorboards like a narrative basilisk. Pattern interrupt. Before we sink any deeper into existential dread about boarding schools, I want to throw this back to you. In the comments, tell me one thing you're either adding to or deleting from your personal Hogwarts after this video. Are you installing extra exits in the moving staircases? Retiring the Basilisk rulebook? Giving the Hufflepuff basement a window? I mean, come on. If we're going to admit the real Hogwarts can't exist, we might as well start building the versions we actually want to visit. Next, we're going to take that idea and push it even further. What happens when you stop treating Hogwarts as a place at all and start treating it as a spell that's being cast on you? So when I say Hogwarts is a spell, I'm not being poetic. I'm being, weirdly literal. Because if you're like me, at some point during this iceberg, you realized the only way we even got close to a real Hogwarts was by doing something no canon source ever asks you to do. Stitching together cut lore, game maps, Pottermore essays, theme park blueprints, and all the messy contradictions the series quietly hopes you don't line up side by side. On their own, each version is manageable. The books are cozy with occasional child endangerment. The films are dramatic with better lighting. The games are, what if the staircase tower was also a racetrack? Pottermore is that one friend who keeps texting you new rules after the board game already started. But when you stack all of it, when you refuse to let any of it go, you get this hyper-complete Hogwarts that is kind of horrifying. You might be asking yourself, okay, but why can't that just be the super nerd extended canon? Because once you accept all of it at once, the tone snaps. This Hogwarts has lethal architecture in every wing, a centuries-long HR crisis in the defense against the dark arts post, sentient plants being diced up in the greenhouses, students regularly cursed, maimed, or nearly killed, and a timetable so broken that the only way it works is if time turners were quietly standard issue for half the staff. And that's before you add the hidden social systems. The class and blood politics we glimpse in the books get way nastier when you factor in cut ghosts, unused houses, extra subjects, and all the average student stories buried in game side quests. Suddenly, you're not at a whimsical boarding school. You're at a structurally unsafe, ethically compromised institution that just happens to serve treacle tart on Sundays. I mean, come on. If the safest place in the wizarding world actually followed all these rules at once, the ministry would have shut it down by goblet of fire. You don't have to take my word for it. The continuity literally can't hold. The calendars don't match. The castle layouts fight each other. The exam schedules are impossible. The only way Hogwarts stays beloved is by staying slightly blurry, slightly inconsistent, so your brain can quietly sand off the worst edges. That vagueness is the real protective enchantment. It lets you choose your Hogwarts, the cozy movie castle, the sprawling game labyrinth, the book version where you politely don't think too hard about OSHA violations. What we've done in this iceberg is temporarily cancel the spell. We forced every version into the same frame and stared at the thing you're not really meant to see. The forbidden, overexposed Hogwarts that's too dark and too broken to ever be fully, officially canon. And now you're in a weird little club. You've seen behind the curtain of the Hogwarts myth. You've watched the gears grind, and you kind of can't unsee it. So the question is, what do you do with that knowledge? In the next section, we're going to talk about how that spell gets cast on you in the first place, and how you can start quietly rewriting it. So by this point, you're not just looking at Hogwarts. You're kind of standing in the middle of a crime scene diagram of Hogwarts, with red string going off in 12 directions, and you might be asking yourself, did this make me hate it? Or did it just make the castle feel way too real? Up at the surface, we started with the cozy stuff. Great hall feasts, moving staircases, the House Point's hourglasses, that whole safest place in the wizarding world PR campaign. We poked at things like the sorting hat, feeling suspiciously like a personality quiz that locks you in at 11, and the way the films turned the castle into this perfect postcard that your brain still lives in, rent-free. That's the Hogwarts everyone thinks they know. Then we went down a layer into the early drafts and cut lore, where Hogwarts stops being a finished product and turns back into a messy Word document. Extra ghosts that never show up, subjects that vanished between notebooks and final print, alternate house names that would have made the merch department cry. If you're like me, stuff like the scrapped castle layouts makes you realize how much of canon is just whatever survived the editing chainsaw. Drop another tier, and we hit the multimedia hydra. Game maps that quietly move classrooms, Pottermore essays that rewrite backstories, theme park Hogwarts that has to be OSHA compliant. We talked about how one version of the castle has a whole extra courtyard, another shrinks the lake, and the illustrated editions sneak in details the text never commits to. At that point, you're literally juggling 3 or 4 incompatible schools in your head. Lower still, the tone shifts. Dark architecture, lethal corridors, cursed classrooms, that vibe where every staircase is a worker's comp claim waiting to happen. The safest place suddenly looks like the most dangerous workplace in Britain. You don't have to take my word for it. The series itself keeps casually racking up near-death experiences that would close any normal school by year 2. Beneath that, we dug into the hidden social systems, house politics, blood status, who actually cleans this place, what it feels like to be the kid who's not the chosen one, just trying to pass transfiguration while your dorm gets blown up again. And then, at the very bottom, in the ethical abyss, we hit things like mandrakes being plant people and the way the castle quietly normalizes a lot of sentient suffering if it keeps the plot moving. Here's the twist, though. Looking at all of that doesn't break Hogwarts. It makes it feel alive. Real places are inconsistent, unfair, beautiful, and kind of horrifying. Your school cafeteria probably had worse health violations than the potions classroom. And you, specifically, stuck around for a 2-hour Iceberg charting all of this. That means you're detail-oriented, lore-obsessed, and maybe just the right amount of unhinged to treat a fictional floor plan like a sacred text. I mean, come on. You watched me complain about exam timetables. So where do we go with that energy? In the next part, we're going to start turning this from, wow, Hogwarts is broken, into, okay, how do I read, watch, and even rewrite this place differently, and give you some concrete ways to keep pulling on these threads once the video ends. So here's what I want to know now that we've emotionally adopted this cursed building together. Out of everything on this iceberg, what was the one Hogwarts detail that actually made you stop and go, wait, what? Was it the mandrakes being plant people you can literally throw at Death Eaters, the basilisk breeding rules that make no sense, or the idea that the safest place in Britain has a higher incident rate than most war zones? Tell me your one thing. The detail that surprised you the most, unsettled you the most, or just quietly ruined a cozy reread on a Tuesday night. Be specific. Quote the scene. Call out the movie shot. Tell me the exact Pottermore line that lives in your head, rent-free. You might be asking yourself why I care which tiny lore splinter got under your skin, but that's how we map which parts of this version of Hogwarts actually hit people hardest. Then, if you're like me, your brain has already started fixing stuff. So I want your headcanon patches. How do you redesign the castle layout so the video games, the films, and the books could all kind of be true at once? What does your Hogwarts calendar look like when you try to make the exam timetables, Quidditch season, and random Hogsmeade trips actually line up? Do you introduce basic safety policies like, I don't know, railings? Or do you lean in and write Hogwarts as openly, gloriously, unsafe with consent forms and hazard pay for prefects? Give me your wildest fixes. Rewrite the ghost roster from the early drafts. Move classrooms. Invent a magical building inspector who shows up every year and has a breakdown in the staff room. You don't have to take my word for it that this is fun. The comments on the last Iceberg turned into a full-on collaborative rewrite of wizarding law, and I'm still thinking about half of those ideas. I also want your suggestions for where we're going to take this Iceberg format next. Do you want to see the Ministry of Magic put under the same microscope, from the atrium fountain to the courtroom architecture? A dark arts iceberg that tracks every cursed object and spell from kid's toy to war crime. A wizarding economy iceberg where we try, and probably fail, to make sense of how anyone buys groceries with that currency system. And because I like knowing who actually made it all the way down here with me, if you're still watching, drop the phrase, architecturally cursed, somewhere in your comment. You can hide it in a sentence. You can just post the words by themselves. That's our little secret handshake, so I know you survived the deep end of the castle. If you want to keep exploring, I've got more corridors for you. Check out the playlist linked on screen for the rest of the Iceberg series. Hit like if this messed with your mental map of Hogwarts in a good way, and subscribe so you don't miss the next time we take a beloved piece of the wizarding world apart, brick by brick. I mean, come on, we've only just started redecorating.